Chapter 634. The body was the most primitive weapon. No weapon, no armor, no fighting energy. In the end, the way to determine victory and defeat would be completely primitive. From this point of view, the two people who were falling rapidly and fighting each other had undoubtedly used this primitive method of attack to the extreme. It looked like a fight between a shrew and a group of children, but it drew the line between life and death so that blood could be seen. At this moment, there was no status, no hierarchy. There was nothing left. The only thing left was that the two of them kept thinking about how to kill each other in this limited way of attack. For example, bite him to death, strangle him to death, or spit on him to disgust him. First, the wind whistled. Because Yema suddenly went berserk, the two of them were falling faster and faster. Although the two of them were not in the mood to care about other things, they vaguely understood that they were about to fall to the bottom of the cliff. Huff, huff, bang. Amidst the breaths that sounded like broken bellows, the blood blade once again shattered mercilessly on Yema's back. At the same time, Tangen's confidence was also shattered. It still didn't work. It still didn't work? It seemed that the saying of fighting to survive in the face of death was mostly just a saying. Or maybe it was because he was not the protagonist in the dark legend who could not be killed, so the protagonist's halo was seriously not enough? It was no wonder that Tang In complained like this. In the modern world, Tang In was also a bookworm on the internet. In those fantasy novels, no matter what kind of predicament the protagonist who transmigrated to the past faced, no matter how strong the enemy was, even if he was beaten badly at first, in the end, his little universe would inexplicably erupt and turn the tables. King transmigrated here too. Why doesn't it work when it comes to me? Could it be that I was not beaten badly enough just now? It can't be. Or is it because I killed too many people before, so my character has already been ruined? It had to be said that the emergence of such a messy and strange thought showed that Tang Un's current state of mind was gradually becoming blurred. It was not because he was depressed or lost his fighting spirit. It was because Tang Un's body was seriously overloaded and was on the verge of collapse. That's right, Tang Un's body was extremely abnormal. From a certain point of view, after the upgrade of the system and the old butler's internal and external training method, Tang Un's external body was much stronger than the Dochi warriors of this world. However, no matter how hard a metal was, it would still be deformed after being forged. Under the violent impact of the Yema battle aura, which had touched the threshold of the void level, Twain's abnormal physique was undoubtedly not enough. If it were not for the fact that his blood chi had been bitterly supporting him, his body would have been torn apart long ago. Forget it, forget it. It's not a bad choice to perish together. Let's get to the bottom of the mountain. Tang and shook his head unconsciously and drooped his eyelids. He was seriously dispirited. Now, he wanted to reach the bottom of the mountain as soon as possible so that both of them would be smashed into meat paste. However, the world was often so mysterious. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, half a minute. The surrounding mountain walls were dark and boundless, and they were still falling rapidly. This made Tang In feel like he was hailing a taxi on the side of the road in the modern world. When he didn't need it, there were empty cars one after another, and the drivers were crying and shouting to give him a ride. When he needed it urgently, there was a lot of traffic on the side of the road, and there was not a single empty car. How sad. With a scream, just as Tang In's brain was getting out of control, he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder near his neck. His whole body trembled, and he immediately woke up. When he turned his head, it turned out that Yema had taken advantage of his momentary trance to bite him again. Yema was seriously injured, and her beautiful silver hair was almost bald, especially her 2 eyes, which had been hit by someone's forehead repeatedly. They were purple and black, and blood was blurred, causing her vision to be blurred. That was why she missed the opportunity and bit the wrong place. Since he was going to vomit blood, Tang In simply spat it on Yema's face. The latter naturally roared and kept blinking, but there was nothing she could do. After spitting out the blood that was stuck in his throat, Tang In felt much more relaxed. He licked his broken lips. Don't misunderstand. Even if Yema was crazy, she wouldn't bite that place. This was because when Tang In bit Yema, he was hit by the silver fighting energy on her body. When he woke up, Tang In immediately shook his head and knocked away Yema, who was like a mad dog. Bang! His brain suddenly felt dizzy again. He could no longer feel his left hand, but he still held Yema's right arm tightly. His 5 fingers almost penetrated Yema's body, and he held onto her ribs to stabilize her. At the same time, he opened his trembling right hand again, and spots of blood gathered on Yema's back. This was purely a subconscious action. At this point in the battle, all tactics and strategies were nonsense, and even logic was nonsense. As long as he hadn't completely fainted, his body memory function would continue to try. At this moment, suddenly beep. The sound of the rapid wind suddenly turned into a sharp whistle, which was extremely ear-piercing. Hearing this, both of them trembled and looked down subconsciously. It was still dark and boundless below. However, both of them knew very well that this sharp whistle was clearly the sound of a heavy object falling from a high place. When it was about to hit the ground, because of the surrounding environment, it quickly bounced back and intersected with the flow of air. It was about to hit the ground. Realizing this, Yema's crazy expression instantly became clear, and there was finally a little panic in his eyes. He was a noble void-level warrior, and he didn't want to die with a nobody like Tang In. Roar. He suddenly raised his head and roared. The silver fighting energy around his body bloomed violently, and rays of light instantly pierced through the darkness like shining stars falling into the abyss, illuminating a large area around him. Most people would have a last burst of energy before they died, and they would do a lot of incredible things. Right now, Yema was no doubt like that. This time, he was definitely at his peak state. Even if his body was in perfect condition, he might not be able to do it. But now, at this critical moment of life and death, dragging his injured body, he suddenly burst out. Shit! Silently cursing, Tang In's face changed. His instantaneous reaction was of course not slow, even faster than Yema. He also expected that his opponent would make a final struggle. But his body was heavily injured, and his mind was on the verge of collapse, which slowed down Tang In's parry. In just a moment, Tang In's left arm, which had been holding onto tightly, let out a few whines and loosened powerlessly. Yema's right arm was finally free. Ha! Laughing wildly, Yema, who was overjoyed, raised his arm, but halfway through, it only grazed Tang In's left shoulder. Immediately, there was a series of bone-cracking sounds, and it directly caved in. This time, it was not the camouflage effect of the bone shrinkage skill. In just a short moment, Tang In's left shoulder was seriously injured, and his left arm that was just about to grab Yema's right hand again completely collapsed. It's over. Tang In's heart suddenly sank, and his face was full of bitterness and disappointment. Just a little bit more. It was all in vain, all in vain. Once Yema's right arm broke free, he could kill him on the spot with a casual slap. At this time, although the screams around them were getting more and more shrill, they did not reach the bottom of the mountain. This time, it was really a hopeless situation. Ha, go to hell. Yema's face was ferocious, and he raised his right arm high. Instantly, the silver light shone in all directions, brilliant but dangerously beautiful. At this time, Tang In, who knew that he was going to die, suddenly grinned and loosened his legs. You want to take revenge? I'd rather fall into a bloody pulp than let you off so easily. But at the same time, the right hand that was wrapped around Yema's back froze. Tang In looked over and saw that the bloody light was still gathering, but it had not formed a dagger yet. It was just an embryonic form that was similar to a short stick. Tang In pursed his lips and shook his head in disdain. Then, he continued to stab the incomplete bloody shadow short stick at Yema's back. Broken skill, you're going to kill me. It's fine if you don't give me the dagger, but you could at least give me a screwdriver. Puff. The sound of a weapon piercing into a warm body could be heard. Blood splattered everywhere, and Tang In's face was half filled with resentment and half stupefied. Ugh! They were still falling rapidly, but the two people who were entangled together looked like statues. Their expressions and movements were frozen, and they did not move at all. After a while, the silver light gradually dimmed. Yima lowered his head stiffly and looked at a thin stick with a bloody luster that pierced out of his left chest where his heart was. He squinted his eyes and found that there was a small blade at the top of the stick in the shape of a cross. He asked dryly, "What is this?" Tangan also looked at the cross blade in a daze and licked his lips. It looks like a screwdriver, oh." Yima nodded slightly and seemed to have understood something. He also seemed to want to ask more, but the silver light had been completely extinguished. Yima closed his eyes regretfully and leaned back. Whoosh! In a whistling wind, the entangled figures of the two people suddenly separated. Tang subconsciously reached out to grab him, but he only managed to grab a few pieces of his black robe. With a tearing sound, Yima's figure instantly disappeared into the surrounding dark environment. What's going on? That's it. Scratching his head, Tangan was caught off guard, and his expression was full of absurdity. Of course it's over. Regardless of how the screwdriver came out, it was indeed formed by gathering Tang's blood chi. Of course, although the Empyrean Bloodblade's power was not bad, this skill was only at the lowest level, so it was undoubtedly impossible to penetrate the defense of a Void Realm martial artist so easily. However, the silver defensive light shield on Yima's body had already been destroyed in the previous entanglement. Just now, when he was free, he was anxious to kill Tangan, so he didn't restore the light shield immediately. This undoubtedly gave this strange screwdriver a heaven-sent opportunity. It easily pierced through Yima's body and went straight to his heart. At the same time, the blood chi contained in it exploded in an instant and directly exploded Yima's entire heart. In this way, Yima naturally had no choice but to die. Whoosh. Don't be like this. Can't you at least fly me up first? Yima. When Tang instantly woke up in this cold wind, his ecstasy only lasted for a few short breaths. Then, he looked at the dark environment around him, and his face suddenly turned bitter. He unbuttoned his clothes while trembling, but before he could open them, they were instantly torn apart by the blade-like wind. Under such gravitational acceleration, there was nothing around him that could give him a temporary respite. Even if Tang had a lot of skills, he could only stare helplessly now. What's more, the screams around him were getting more and more urgent. It was obvious that there was not much time left. It was not that Tang couldn't react in time, but the world was changing too fast. Just a few minutes ago, Tang was still hoping to fall to the ground as soon as possible, so that he could die together with his opponent. But now he wished that this cliff abyss could become a bottomless pit, so that he could have some time to think about other ways to escape. Calm down, there must be a way, there must be... Just as Tangan's brain was spinning rapidly, the pores all over his body suddenly opened, and a chill instantly rushed up from his tailbone. The alarm bell rang. There was no doubt that this was a sharp premonition of impending danger. Too fast. Sighing secretly, Tang immediately opened his eyes wide and stared down. His eyes were extremely greedy. It was said that before the Grim Reaper came, people's eyes would quickly flash through their whole life. But unfortunately, there was only darkness in Tangan's eyes, but his mind became more and more clear. Somehow, a question suddenly appeared in his mind. If I die, who will remember me? He immediately asked and answered his own question. Josiah. I'm the most familiar with her, so she will definitely remember me. As for the time, 10 years. It seems a bit long. Then 3 years? Bah, my charm isn't that miserable, right? It'll take at least 5 years. Little Carol, TSK. Children's thoughts are harder to guess. It might take a lifetime or 2 or 3 years. David and the others should come to find me and avenge me. Unfortunately, I've already killed my enemy, so there's nothing left. Oh, and a group of friends in Lion City. Jack, Alan, Lena. Oh, forget about Jack. He'll forget about me in the blink of an eye if I give him a few gold coins. Alan and Lena, sigh. I haven't seen them for a long time. They should have already forgotten me. Ha ha, it's okay. There's also the washing machine. Isn't it said that it's already sold all over the country? Although I'm no longer in this world, there are still legends of me everywhere. Wah! Suddenly, his breathing stopped, and a great pressure came head-on. It's finally over, my journey to another world. I wonder if I could be lucky enough to transmigrate again. All right. When the alarm bell in his heart was ringing to its limit, Tang In suddenly remembered that there was still an important person that he had not taken care of, but there was not enough time. Bang! Voila! In the system space, the old butler looked at the light screen in front of him with his hands behind his back, his expression indifferent. Suddenly, a shrill cry resounded through the space. "Old butler, I'm leaving, don't miss me too much." The voice lingered in the air, echoing endlessly, and sounded very creepy. Even someone as calm as the old butler could not help but twitch the corner of his eyes when he heard this shrill cry, and his mouth twitched slightly. At this moment, voila! On the light screen, Tang In fell straight into the calm underground lake like a cannonball, instantly splashing water tens of meters high into the sky. The waves were noisy, and the momentum was really shocking. That's right. Who would have known that there was such an underground lake hidden at the bottom of the abyss under the cliff? It seemed to be a hopeless situation without any suspense. But there was a hidden life in this place where mountains and rivers intersected. Nature's uncanny workmanship was amazing. The old butler's expression was still indifferent, and he was not moved at all. Tang In could not see the bottom of the abyss with his naked eyes, but it did not mean that the system light screen could not see it. After about 3 minutes, the waves on the lake did not stop, but a figure suddenly emerged from the water. Needless to say, this was Tang In, who had survived a great disaster. In fact, falling from such a height, even if there was water below, an ordinary person would undoubtedly die in an instant when they touched it. Fortunately, Tang In was not an ordinary person, and the speed of his fall would be slightly reduced when the Yemo repeatedly broke out. In this way, Tang In was lucky enough to survive. However, even so, Tang In only floated out of the water in the light screen, and his hands and feet were subconsciously waving. His eyes were blank, and it was obvious that he had fallen into a daze, and he would not be able to recover in a short time. Seeing this, the old butler's expression softened slightly, and he shook his head slightly, as if he was also lamenting about this guy's heaven-defying luck. Then, just as the old butler waved his hand to turn off the light screen, his eyes suddenly focused, and he saw a black shadow suddenly appear on the light screen, flashing away, and coincidentally smashing onto Tang In. Voila! Another monstrous splash. The old butler was startled, and then he waved his hand to change the angle of the light screen. First, he saw the woman who suddenly smashed down. Wasn't that Lan Sha? With Tang In as a cushion, not only did she not die, but she also did not faint. Then, he switched to Tang In, only to find that his eyes were tightly shut and his mouth was bubbling with water, and he kept sinking. Needless to say, this was definitely the end of him. Phew! The old butler exhaled softly, and the corners of his mouth twitched a few times, and he was expressionless. This wretch. Chapter 635. All right, since our main character, Tang In, thought of Josiah the moment before he died, then we might as well give him some face and turn our attention back to Bran to see what this gray coat army intelligence chief was doing. Morning, Mountain Creek City. The cold wind was not cold, and the sun was warm. Compared to the bone-chilling and uninhabitable northern wilderness, although it was also winter in Bran, in the holy city of the hinterland of the north, the winter chill was not as abnormal. Of course, this was relative. If it was from the mouths of the old women in Mountain Creek City, it would not be difficult to hear such nagging. This year's winter seems to be colder. The Riverside Tavern was a legitimate business. Just from the name, one would know what it did. Because the location was slightly remote, business was naturally not too good. Most of the customers who came were the old customers from around the area. It was quiet and indifferent. When the tavern had just opened, the surrounding civilians had also discussed it. They said that the tavern would probably not be open for long, and that it would be like the previous owner of the tavern who would choose to sell it after a period of time. But at least the current situation was not like this. Although the tavern's business was still not improving, it was still open for business as usual every day, rain or shine. Some of the old drunkards around were naturally overjoyed when they saw this. Sometimes, they would even deliberately call their friends over to buy a few cups of cheap ale to boost the popularity, fearing that the tavern would close down. If that was the case, they would have to run far away if they wanted a drink. These interesting and laughable actions caused the tavern's business to gradually improve for a period of time, making the owner somewhat unsure whether to laugh or cry. But in reality, these drunkards were completely overthinking. Because if there were no accidents, this tavern would continue to stand there. After all, it was the headquarters of the Gray Coat Army's secret organization. Of course, the so-called headquarters was actually just a saying. It was only called this because the highest leader of the secret organization, Josiah, often stayed here. Because it was in the morning, the tavern was extremely quiet. There were only 2 or 3 customers who looked like drunkards. They toasted each other, shook their heads, and muttered from time to time, or suddenly cursed loudly, saying that life was not easy and so on. In addition, there was a middle-aged owner sitting by the door, calmly wiping the counter in front of him with a rag over and over again. He seemed to be used to this situation and had no intention of restraining the drunkards. But from time to time, he would cast his gaze to the corner of the hall and shake his head slightly, with a look of regret. Sitting there was a man with disheveled hair who was engrossed in drinking. The table was littered with empty wine jars. Because of the angle, it was not clear what he looked like. However, if there was someone who paid attention to details, he would find that although he looked a little sloppy, his back was straight. It wasn't done on purpose. Rather, it seemed to be a natural posture that had been trained for many years. It was the unique temperament of a soldier. At this moment, the man shook the wine jar in his hand, as if he had already finished it. Seeing this, the middle-aged owner sighed, got up, and walked over. He knocked on the table and said softly, "Drink less. You should go back and rest." His hand paused, and he put down the bottle. That person slowly raised his head. He had a handsome appearance and was not very old. However, the messy beard on his face, which was obviously ungroomed, and his bloodshot eyes made him look even more down and out. Of course, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was the long and terrifying scar that stretched from the corner of his left eye to his chin, destroying his handsome appearance. Coupled with his current appearance, he looked somewhat ferocious. However, although his face was ferocious and he had drunk a lot of wine, there was not a single empty bottle on the floor. It could be seen that the young man still had some self-control and had not lost his mind. Nodding slightly, he accepted the concern. The young man was easy to talk to. He stood up unsteadily with a bottle of wine that had just been opened and staggered towards the back door of the tavern. It was unknown whether he was a guest here or an employee of the tavern. Eat, dine and dash. A drunkard who was not far away also stood up unsteadily when he saw the young man leave without paying the bill. He rolled up his sleeves and said with a face full of indignation, "Boss, don't be afraid. I'll help you get justice." Kid, don't go. It's a misunderstanding. The middle-aged shopkeeper was stunned when he saw this. He hurriedly went up to block the drunkard. "He's my long-term guest. I've already given him enough money." "Oh, so it's like that. That's good. Boss, if you encounter any situation in the future, just look for me. Hussein, will definitely cover this area. Yes. I'll have to trouble you in the future." While the middle-aged owner was dealing with the customers of the tavern, the young man didn't seem to have heard the small dispute. He didn't stop walking and staggered out of the tavern's hall through the back door. There were a few steps at the back door. When a young man reached here, he narrowed his slightly red eyes and walked with difficulty. He swayed 3 times and looked like he was about to fall. At this moment, a person who was dressed as a waiter of the tavern rushed in from the front door with a piece of white paper in his hand. He looked at the middle-aged owner and nodded. Then he quickly ran to the back door as if he had something urgent to do. The steps weren't wide. Although the waiter had already dodged and was about to pass through from the side, he didn't expect that the young man would stagger and the two would bump into each other. Bang! The waiter was fine. He waved the white paper in his hand and quickly stabilized himself. However, the young man who drank too much couldn't stand it. His body tilted and he sat down on the steps. Seeing this, the waiter quickly bent over to support him. He glanced around and apologized in a low voice. "I'm sorry, Master Borg. I walked in a hurry." "It's okay. It has nothing to do with you. I drank too much." The young man waved his hand and got up from the ground. He glanced around and saw the word "wanted" on the white paper in the waiter's hand. There was also a portrait. He asked casually, "What is this?" The waiter hesitated for a moment and replied, "This is something to report to the commander." The so-called commander was naturally Josiah's other identity, the commander of the Gray Coat Army's publicity department. For the safety of the leader of the secret organization, Josiah didn't care about it at all. Therefore, although her current position was much higher than the commander, the people in the organization usually called her commander. "Josiah." The young man narrowed his eyes. His gaze was complicated. After a moment, he waved his hand and said, "I'm fine. Go to your thing." "Yes." Seeing the waiter turn to the left and walk away, the young man stood there in a daze. Then he shook his head and drank a mouthful of wine. He continued to stagger forward. Yes, this young man was Borg, whom he hadn't seen for a long time. The battle between the Brand and the Northern Wilderness had ended long ago. As one of the middle-level generals of the Gray Coat Army who reinforced the Brand, he naturally shouldn't be here alone. Moreover, he had been here for nearly a month. The reason was naturally because of that embarrassing incident. After Borg's face was disfigured, he led his troops to retreat to the Zeechan Legion's defense area. He suddenly encountered Josiah in the frontline city, but he was immediately slapped in the face. Then, Borg lost his mind and ordered his soldiers to attack Michaud. As a result, not only did he not gain any advantage, but after Michaud announced that he was a wounded soldier under Frey's command, he was beaten up by the passing Thunderbolt's army soldiers and was finally imprisoned by Zeechan soldiers. This incident wasn't very big, but it was naturally impossible to pretend that it didn't happen. The Thunderbolt soldiers who beat Michaud were justified, and Borg became a villain who intended to destroy the cooperation between the two sides. The Zeechan Legion naturally didn't care about this matter. In the end, they simply pushed the blame to the frontline generals of the Gray Coat Army. Because of his identity, Borg didn't receive any punishment. Of course, it was undoubtedly unrealistic for him to continue to stay at the front line. Using the injury on his face, Borg was reprimanded by the highest general of the Gray Coat Army stationed at the front line, General Daniel, and left the front line dejectedly. After Borg's third uncle, Enoch of the secret organization, received the news, he sent someone to pick him up. He wanted him to recuperate in the city behind the front line and adjust his condition. However, judging from the current situation, Borg's condition obviously hadn't adjusted well. On the contrary, after looking at the scar on his face and touching the place where Josiah slapped him, Borg's heart felt as if it was being devoured by thousands of ants. He tossed and turned in torment, and could only numb himself with alcohol all day long in exchange for a moment of peace. How dare you hit me, that woman bitch?" With his head tilted back and his footsteps staggering, the scar on Borg's face was like a living centipede at this time, twisting and twisting, slightly red, and truly hideous and terrifying. His footsteps suddenly stopped, and Borg shook his head. Only then did he realize that he wasn't walking toward the guest room. Instead, he subconsciously came to the place where Josiah was discussing matters. Slap! Borg suddenly raised his hand and slapped himself heavily in the face. He hugged his head and growled, "You're still thinking about her, still thinking about that bitch. Borg, you idiot, idiot." He insulted himself like a madman. His foul language was extremely unpleasant to the ears. After a moment, Borg turned around while panting and walked back. However, he only took a few steps before he suddenly turned his head and looked at the meeting place with a strange expression. "Haha, it's okay to take a look, this bitch. Just one more look, oh bitch." Chapter 636. His footsteps were messy as he carried the wine jar and muttered, "Bitch, bitch." Although he was deceiving himself, since he had already made up his mind, Boar could not resist the inexplicable desire in his heart and staggered toward the meeting hall. When he was only a few dozen meters away, he glanced around with his slightly red eyes and muttered, "Ah, there are even sentries. After all, this was the headquarters of a secret organization, not to mention an important meeting place." Naturally, there were many sentries around, whether in the open or in the dark. Of course, Boar was not an outsider and had lived here for more than a month, so no guards came forward to stop him. There seemed to be more people than before. "I like to see what you're up to." Boar shook his head in disdain as he scanned the sudden increase in guards with his hazy, drunken eyes. He paused and then walked around the meeting hall to the left. The attention of the surrounding sentries was focused on the periphery, and Boar was not on guard against his own people. Now that he had already bypassed the meeting hall, it was naturally impossible for them to track and monitor him. Therefore, after Borg avoided the sentries, he suddenly passed through a few flower bushes diagonally and arrived at the back of the meeting hall without anyone noticing. There were naturally sentries here, but Borg's current position was ingenious. He hid beside the flower bushes under the back window and was an out-and-out surveillance blind spot, putting everything else aside, just based on his skillful hiding and sneaking around. Perhaps he knew that this was not the first time Borg had done something like this. Damn it. Why are the doors and windows all closed? Isn't it here? Or was the person just lying to me? Borg looked up and squinted at the completely closed meeting hall and could not help but frown and curse. An important place like the meeting hall was naturally heavily guarded, but it was impossible to completely close the doors and windows every time something was discussed. In fact, from Borg's words just now, he knew that this was not the case before. However, Borg immediately knew that the waiter did not lie to him, because he could still faintly hear the conversation inside through the back window. But so mysterious. Borg sneered disdainfully and stood up with the wine jar in his hand. He could not help but look disappointed. His purpose of coming here was to peek at Josiah. Now that the doors and windows were locked, there was naturally no need to stay any longer. However, just as he turned around, a voice suddenly sounded out by his ear, causing Borg's body to suddenly tremble. He opened his mouth and was slightly stunned. Tang in? That bastard. In the conference hall. The space in a room was not small, but after the room was cleared, there was only Josiah in his white robe and the waiter from before. Captain, according to reliable sources, Sylvia has returned to Bran a few days ago. However, we haven't found her exact location yet. She should be in a church somewhere. After Sylvia returned, this wanted notice from the headquarters of the Northern Temple of Light was urgently sent to every city. It should cover the entire north in a few days. Well, there's an unfamiliar face on it. I'm not sure if it's Tang in. Josiah took the notice and glanced at the wanted portrait on it. He bit his lip and said with certainty. Nodding, the waiter also agreed with this guess. After all, Sylvia had disappeared while chasing after Tang in. Now that she had returned, the Temple of Light issued such a wanted notice. Naturally, it was easy for people to associate it with Tang in. Moreover, Josiah was very clear about Tang in's ability to disguise himself, so it was not surprising that such an unfamiliar face would appear. The waiter was arranged to do such a job, so he was naturally Josiah's absolute confidant. Naturally, he knew a thing or two about the inside story and Tang in's ability. He looked up at Josiah, who was in a rare daze, and whispered, "Captain, don't worry. Since Sylvia issued such a wanted notice when she returned, it means that Captain Tang and has escaped this disaster. I believe that he will return to Bran soon." Yes, there was no doubt that this speculation was reasonable. Joshua nodded slightly upon hearing this, and the corner of her mouth lifted into a bright and relaxed smile. He, of course, with his ability, even if he enters the northern wilderness, he will be able to escape unscathed. It was obvious that after hearing this news, Josiah was in a good mood. In fact, he was quite excited. Paused for a while. Ching Chong's fingers tapped lightly on the table before her. She calmed herself down and said with a smile, "Everyone, you've done well this time. I will reward you later. Captain, this is what we should do. With a wave of his hand, Josiah stopped the waiter who stood up to salute and said with a smile, "Haha, this is what you deserve. Furthermore, the current secret agency is not as poor as before, so of course, you will be rewarded." But she paused, and her slender shoulders straightened. Her beautiful face was solemn. "Please keep this a secret. If there is even the slightest leak, I will not let you off easily." As the saying goes, the environment changes the body. Josiah, who was getting more and more used to it, naturally did not have the difficult situation that he had when he first took over the secret agency. His expression darkened slightly, and under the combination of kindness and authority, there was an intimidating presence that could not be moved by 10,000 mountains. The waiter's breath caught, and he quickly stood up and bowed. He replied seriously, "Don't worry, Captain. This will only rot in our minds and will not be leaked." Josiah nodded, and his serious expression quickly relaxed. "You're all personally handpicked by me, so of course I am not worried. This is just for your benefit. After all, if this is exposed, the consequences will be unpredictable. Go, send a message to the front line and tell them to work harder and continue to keep an eye on the border. If you can meet Tang Yin, it will be best if you can tell him about the situation." "Yes." The waiter bowed again and turned to open the door of the meeting room. "Wait a minute." As if remembering something, Josiah frowned and asked, "Is there still no news of little Carol?" I am incompetent. The organizations in various cities have sent people to search for her, but there is still no accurate news." "It's okay. No news is also good news." He raised his head and gently touched his forehead. He shook his head slightly. "Under Tang En's teachings, little Carol is first class in terms of martial arts, strength, hiding, and disguise. It is reasonable that you can't find her. Go, send people to continue the search." "Yes." Bang! As soon as the door closed. Phew! Josiah's straight shoulders and back relaxed instantly. He let out a long breath and stroked the wanted portrait with his right hand. Joy, anticipation, disappointment. All kinds of emotions mixed together. His expression was complicated and indescribable, but it was mostly excitement. In the dark hall, bright light penetrated through the cracks of the doors and windows. There was dust floating in the air, and it was quiet. After a while, a sigh of relief sounded. I know you'll be fine, Tang." Josiah had been collecting information about Tang Yin from beginning to end. She even went to the front line for this. Unfortunately, when she arrived at the front line, she just happened to pass by Tang Yin. Then, she got the news from various channels that Sylvia had chased Tang Yin into the northern wilderness. After confirming the authenticity of this news, Josiah was stunned for a long time. Then, she began to collect information about Sylvia. However, the more information she gathered, the more uncertain Josiah became. She vaguely knew that Sylvia's strength should be higher than Tang En's. Realizing this, Josiah was undoubtedly more worried and anxious. However, she was the supreme leader of the secret organization. Naturally, she could not stay at the front line for a long time. So, in the end, she could only return to Mountain Stream City after setting up branches in the cities near the border. Of course, although Josiah's people returned to the hinterland of the northern brand, she had some free time. Her attention was always on the front line. To be honest, Josiah was very conflicted at that time. On one hand, she hoped to get the news as soon as possible. On the other hand, she was afraid that something bad would happen. She faintly resisted the news. After waiting anxiously for a whole month, she finally got the news about Tang Yin. It was good news. Zhou's mood was unquestionably excited. Her slender fingers tapped on the table rapidly, like a cheerful sonata. Then, she got up and walked back and forth a few steps. Suddenly, she touched her forehead. "Oh, I almost forgot. I should send a message to Dawn City. Where's a pen and paper?" Just as Josiah was excitedly searching for a pen and paper in the room, Borg, who was outside the back window, took a few steps back. His slightly red eyes flashed with a strange light. The corners of his mouth gradually cracked open. "Ha! It seems like I heard a very important piece of news. Sylvia? Is it the sensational incident at the front line canyon? I really didn't expect it. Tang in, tang in. After muttering to himself for a few seconds, Borg suddenly raised his head and gulped down a large mouthful of wine. He strode to the side with a vicious expression. Ha! This time, I want to see if you can survive. Chapter 637. At noon, in a corner of the western district of Mountain Creek City, rows of single-story houses were arranged neatly, and the monotonous black and gray walls contrasted with each other. It looked a little awkward, like an unfinished abstract ink painting. The narrow streets were filled with dust and potholes, like a piece of cheese that had been left out for a long time. It was obviously not suitable for any means of transportation other than walking. Every city had its glamorous side, but of course, there would also be dirty and dilapidated corners. This was unavoidable, and even Mountain Creek City, which was known as the Holy City of the North, was no exception. At this moment, in a corner of the street. Excuse me, does Painter Hungseer live here? Hungseer? You mean that poor painter, right? Yes, follow this street and walk all the way to the innermost left. Oh, thank you, and haha, you're welcome. After bidding farewell to the kind auntie, the passerby pulled down the furry collar that covered his face tightly, revealing a long scar that looked like a centipede. Needless to say, this was Borg, who had just come out of the tavern by the stream. The street was not long, and he soon reached the end. The innermost left. TSK, it should be this. Borg narrowed his eyes and looked at the dilapidated house in front of him. He nodded, took a few steps forward, and knocked on the wooden door. Bang, bang, bang. Bang, bang, bang. The knocking continued, but there was no sound from inside, as if the owner was not home. However, just as Borg frowned, the door creaked open. Who are you? The person who opened the door was a middle-aged man. His eyes were sunken, and his body was thin. He wore a loose robe that was wrinkled and had not been washed for a long time. He looked tired and sleepy. Who I am is not important. Are you Painter Hungseer? Seeing that the middle-aged man nodded subconsciously, Borg's lips curled into a strange sneer. He opened his left hand, revealing a few shiny gold coins that had an attractive luster. I'll talk about the characteristics, and you can draw a portrait. As long as I'm satisfied, these 5 gold coins are yours. The middle-aged man called Hansel was stunned at first, but then he was overjoyed. Just by looking at the surrounding environment, one could tell that his living conditions were very bad. Just a portrait, and he could earn 5 gold coins. This was indeed a great temptation to him. That's right. Art cannot be measured by money, but sometimes artists also need money to survive. No problem. At first, he hurriedly agreed. Then he scratched his head and looked hesitant. Although I have never doubted my drawing skills, why did you come looking for me? You should know that this place of mine is very remote. That's exactly what I want. Borg's expression didn't change, and he didn't answer the question. Instead, he pushed the door open and entered. Let's begin. Okay. The room was in a mess. Paper and brushes were scattered everywhere. Even the walls were painted with various patterns. It was indeed the appearance of a destitute artist. Soon, after setting up the easel, Hansel looked at Borg with a brush in his hand. The latter pinched his chin and pondered for a moment before saying, "It's a young man. His hair is black and not long. As for his face, well, it's very ordinary." While Borg was frowning as he tried to recall, Hansel held the paintbrush and gestured a few times. In the end, he still couldn't draw. He helplessly raised his head and said, "Mister, please describe it in more detail. For example, the shape of his nose, the size of his lips, whether his cheekbones are obvious. Also, what are his distinctive features?" Distinctive features. Borg pinched the bridge of his nose and looked a little conflicted. Ordinary, very ordinary. Oh, there's a distinctive feature. Just as Hansel was speechless, Borg's eyes suddenly lit up. He clapped his hands and said, "His eyes are slimmer than ordinary people, and his pupils are black. It's disgusting to look at. Slimmer eyes, black pupils? That's not common. Okay, count it as a distinctive feature." Hansel's brush moved slightly. First, he drew the outline, Then he carefully drew a pair of slimmer eyes. He asked what else? And ordinary. The progress of the portrait wasn't smooth. It wasn't that Hansel's skills weren't good enough. It was only now that Borg realized how difficult it was to accurately depict the annoying guy in his heart. It wasn't that he couldn't remember. Borg remembered the guy's face very clearly, as if it was carved into his heart. But remembering it clearly didn't mean that he could accurately depict it. Oh, that damn common face. Fortunately, Hansel's drawing skills were quite good. Although it took a lot of effort, the two of them continued to gesture and discuss, and finally succeeded in drawing it. Humph! With just a glance, Borg's eyes suddenly flashed with a fierce light. He snorted and clenched his fists. Needless to say, from this reaction, the drawing was very good. On the drawing paper, there was an average-sized nose, average-sized lips, average-sized ears, average-sized eyebrows. Other than the long and narrow eyes, almost all of the facial features were average-sized. It was very ordinary. This was the legendary common face, the Tang, and that we were all familiar with. Barely suppressing the inexplicable anger in his heart, Borg nodded and praised. Not bad. I'm very satisfied. Then, under Hansel's expectant gaze, he reached into his pocket as if to take out a gold coin. But when he reached out, it was a short sword. With a cold flash, poof, it directly pierced into Hansel's heart. Sorry, your drawing skills are too good. So good that I don't dare to let you live. Stumbling a few steps, Hansel's eyes were filled with confusion and pain. He leaned back, bang. A few easels were knocked over, and the drawing paper on the ground was instantly stained with blood. After twitching a few times, he fell silent and stopped moving. Glancing at the corpse on the ground, Borg let out a long sigh. The gloominess in his heart because of a certain person dissipated instantly. What Borg said just now seemed like a joke, but in fact, it was from his heart. In fact, when Hansel took on this business, this was destined to be the outcome. After seeing that Hansel's drawing skills were indeed good, Borg naturally couldn't let him live. After all, if something happened, his portrait would undoubtedly be easier to draw. Bending over to take the brush in Hansel's hand, Borg didn't intend to deal with the corpse on the ground. It was obvious that such a reclusive artist wouldn't interact much with the people around him. Perhaps only when the corpse started to smell would people find out. He picked up a blank drawing paper and swept away the debris on the table beside him. In this room that was gradually filled with the smell of blood, Borg calmly pulled a wooden chair and sat down. After pondering for a while, he began to draw and murmured softly, Tang En, an Earth-level warrior proficient in disguise, a member of the Gray Coat Army. Well, should I write this? The brush stopped, and he tilted his head. Only by revealing this identity could he logically lead Tang in to sneak into the army and go to the front line, and then what happened in the canyon afterward. So he decided to continue writing. Oh, you have a small team in the gray space. Humph! How dare you set me up, me show, and you can't escape. Should I add Josiah? She's also one of the accomplices. TSK, no. I'm also temporarily living in a tavern by the creek. Okay, I'll be merciful and give you a chance, haha. The room was dim, and the smell of blood was getting stronger, but Borg, who was busy drawing, didn't seem to feel it. From time to time, he whispered in a low voice or raised his head and laughed wildly, causing his body to constantly tremble. It was an indescribably strange scene. Half an hour later, outside the church of Mountain Stream City, Borg, who had covered his face again, wandered for 2 or 3 minutes, then walked to a little boy who was playing. He bent down and spread out his palm, all kinds of colorful candies. Little boy, can you do Uncle a favor? As long as you give these 2 pieces of paper to the uncle and aunt in the church, these candies are all yours. Licking his lips and looking at the tempting candies, the little boy nodded heavily. Good boy. Uncle will reward you first. Well, take it, go. During the day, the church was of course open. After receiving the reward, the little boy's legs moved quickly and he ran into the church. Ignorant, he didn't know what kind of monstrous waves the thin paper in his hand, which was only worth a few candies, would cause. Of course, in fact, even Borg, the initiator, would never have thought that the situation would be out of control. Perhaps he had some feeling in his heart, but the slight drunkenness and the humiliation and hatred in his head had completely blinded his heart and eyes. Chapter 638. Whoosh, 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 the shuttle-shaped water currents shot through the water like arrows, causing countless tiny bubbles to burst and rise. Tang Yin and the others were in an awkward position now. Lan Sha had already scouted the area once, so the place they chose to enter the water was actually above the underground tunnel. However, due to the sudden appearance of these strange fish, they could not go down rashly. Give up? Impossible. There was only one corpse of Yema. If they turned around and went ashore now, they would only encounter a worse situation the next time they entered the water in the blink of an eye. Tang and sorted out the pros and cons. He gestured to Lan Sha, whose mouth was bulging and deflating. Then, he pressed on Lan Sha's shoulder, and the two of them sank rapidly as if they were carrying a rock. Although they seemed to have encountered trouble from the beginning, Lan Sha did not panic at all. She did not make any hand gestures to express her doubts. Instead, she pursed her lips tightly and allowed Tang in to lead her. As long as one was in a high position, they would at least understand that professional matters should be left to the professionals. As expected, after diving for a few seconds, Lan Sha suddenly narrowed her eyes and stared at the slender black shadow that suddenly appeared in her line of sight and was rapidly rushing toward her glabella. A strange fish? If it could be seen by Lan Sha's poor eyesight, then this strange fish was undoubtedly very close. However, before Lan Sha could give a warning, a blade suddenly flashed and accurately cut the fast-moving strange fish into two. Swoosh! As the short sword slashed, a small ball of scarlet blood suddenly exploded in the lake water and slowly spread. Lan Sha was stunned. Then, she pursed her lips and withdrew her gaze. She wiped the spreading blood and fell downward. We still bumped into it. Tang and shook his head slightly and smiled bitterly. Lan Sha could not see, but with his unique spying vision, he saw that the shuttle-shaped water currents around them slowed down when the blood had just spread. Some of the strange fish that were close to them had slowly turned their heads. Obviously, as they had guessed before, these strange fish were extremely sensitive to the composition of blood. As long as it was in this body of water, even if it was just an insignificant drop of blood, they would be able to sense it. This should be the reason why these strange fish that had obviously come from afar were rushing towards Yama's corpse. Of course, even if he had confirmed this beforehand, Tang In still had to make a move because he had no other choice. Squinting his long and narrow eyes, Tang In let out a muffled groan under the water. The two of them suddenly sank again, as if there was an iron ball tied to their feet, causing a string of splashes as they fell rapidly. At the same time, the short sword in his hand was like a coiled snake, flicking its tongue from time to time, causing blood to splatter everywhere. Since he had already been exposed, he naturally couldn't care less. The faster he rushed into the passageway, the better. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The previously orderly shuttle-shaped water current suddenly became chaotic. The strange fish closest to the blood turned around and rushed toward the corpse of their companion without hesitation. After some hesitation, the strange fish on the periphery split into two directions. Some of them still charged forward. After all, the smell of blood was stronger there. Some of them seemed to have discovered Tang In's group and rushed over. Whoosh, 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 the effect of Tang In's prompt decision was very obvious. After killing more than 10 strange fish, he quickly rushed out of the small group of strange fish. Waves of sharp whistles came from above, and the numerous bubbles were about to reach his head. In this situation, Tang In felt as if he had entered a battlefield in the modern world. Smoke rose everywhere, and bullets kept shuttling around him. Although they didn't hit him, the sharp whistles that cut through the air and the faint residual heat of the bullet marks that brushed past his body were enough to make his hair stand on end. Moreover, this was only the first round of attacks. These strange fish were about a foot long, and their bodies were extremely stiff. However, it didn't affect their flexibility in changing directions in the water. With just a swing of their tails, they caught up with him not far behind. Upon seeing this, Tang indecisively changed positions with Lan Sha. He went to the top, and Lan Sha went to the bottom. Then, his throat moved slightly as he exhaled. Buzz! A large string of bubbles immediately slipped out of his mouth and quickly floated upward. At the same time, a ring-shaped ripple vibrated out and instantly covered the dense group of strange fish that were chasing him. Because it was a tail chase, almost all the strange fish behind him were hit. However, the effect made Tang Yin's face turn even uglier. This was because these strange fish only paused when they were covered by the sound wave, and their speed slowed down slightly. Then, they swayed their tails and continued to chase without any damage. F***CK. He waved his dagger and instantly killed a few of the fastest strange fish, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The effect was obvious. The strange fish that were closest to him immediately abandoned Tang Yin and quickly turned around, greedily chasing and gnawing on the corpses of their companions. Of course, this was just drinking poison to quench thirst. The stronger the smell of blood here, the more strange fish would rush over. However, Tang Yin didn't have time to think about this now. Taking advantage of the chaos in the group of fish behind him, he grabbed Lan Sha's shoulder and suddenly changed direction and went straight to the bottom left. Without Lan Sha's guidance, Tang Yin easily found an underwater tunnel that was about 2 feet in length and width with his peeping skill. The surrounding water plants swayed, and the entrance of the tunnel was dark. He couldn't see what was inside. At the same time, in his peeping vision, the water ripples here were different from the gentle and slow ones above. They became extremely intertwined and turbulent. In reality, as soon as they got close, a strong suction force caused Tang Yin and Lu Zilong's bodies to sway. There was no doubt that this underwater tunnel was connected from the turbulent water flow. As for where it led to, it wasn't something that Tang Yin and Lu Zilong could consider at the moment. At this point, Tang Yin didn't need to exert any strength. The turbulent water automatically brought them to the tunnel quickly. Behind them, the strange fish were not affected by the turbulent water flow at all. They were also chasing after them with ease, and their speed was even faster than before. Tang Yin squinted and couldn't help but grin slightly. This was because in his peeping vision, every time the strange fish twisted their bodies and swung their tails, they chose to go through the gaps between the water ripples. In this way, not only were they not blocked by the turbulent water flow, but they could also increase their speed with the help of the water flow. It was really shocking. Of course, this was not a coincidence, but a fish's natural instinct for the flow of water. In other words, this was their home ground. The land humans like Tang Yin and Lan Sha were completely not enough to deal with them. Soon, the strange fish caught up to them again and entered their attack range. At this moment, Tang Yin pulled Lan Sha, and the two rushed into the tunnel in an instant. The tunnel was darker than the lake, but of course, this didn't affect Tang Yin's vision. He turned his head and looked around, and he couldn't help but feel happy. It turned out that not far ahead, the tunnel suddenly became narrow. It was probably only able to allow 2 people to pass through. It was an excellent blocking terrain that was easy to defend and difficult to attack. With a shake of his body, Tang Yin gestured to Lan Sha to dodge quickly, and then pushed her forward with all his strength. This was not a heroic sacrifice or something like that. It was because Tang Yin's speed with Lan Sha was too slow. He could only let Lan Sha run for a distance first, and then he could quickly catch up with her after blocking for a while. This was more efficient. With his feet firmly planted, Tang Yin suddenly turned around. The blade light swirled around his body and instantly killed more than a dozen strange fish that were chasing behind him. Chi, chi, chi. Blood gathered in one place, and suddenly dyed a large area around him red. However, under the washing of the water flow, they rushed past Tang Yin in the blink of an eye. Smelling the scent of blood, the school of strange fish instantly went crazy. They charged at Twain from all angles like arrows, carrying strings of fine bubbles with them. Tang In stood in the narrow cave with a piercingly cold expression. His black hair danced wildly, and his almond-shaped pupils kept shrinking and enlarging. The next moment, the short sword in his hand was completely unaffected by the water flow. It was as fast as the wind, and waves of phantoms stirred up the water. Whether the strange fish rushed over individually or in groups, as long as they entered Tang Un's attack range, they could not escape the seemingly light but absolutely precise sword blow to their heads. Kill, 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 explode, explode. One man can hold the pass, and 10,000 can't get through. In just a short moment, despite the constant washing of the rapid water flow, the blood around him inevitably spread. Tang Yin's killing power did not stop, and the strange fish did not stop rushing. Both sides suddenly fell into a subtle stalemate. Of course, this stalemate would not last long. After all, Tang Un was only one person, and he was in such a physical state. As long as the enemy did not retreat, he would definitely not be able to hold on for long. But would the strange fish retreat? The answer was obvious. The strange fish were emotionless. They were not complicated like humans, who would retreat in fear when they saw that the situation was not good. In their eyes, Tang In was undoubtedly a delicacy. Knowing this was enough. As for other things like danger, whether they would lose their lives, sorry, they were not smart enough to consider so much. About a minute passed. There was a muffled groan, and some air bubbles came out of Tang Un's nostrils. The short sword did not stop, and his left hand retracted to grab his shoulder. There, a strange fish that had passed through the dense attack net was biting his flesh with its sawtooth mouth. The way it ate was not polite at all. After biting a piece of flesh, not only did it not stop, but it also swung its tail as if it wanted to eat directly from the wound. Tang In naturally did not care about some superficial wounds, but his left shoulder was seriously injured, and it was almost in a half-collapsed state. It was not easy to suppress the injury there, so naturally, he could not let this little strange fish cause it. He pinched it lightly with 2 fingers, and there was a flash of blood. Bang, it exploded. Taking advantage of this moment, Tang In turned his head slightly and glanced behind. Then, the corner of his eyes could not help but twitch. Lan Sha did not run far, at least not out of the scope of surveillance. Of course, it was not that she did not want to run, but a horizontal current rolled over, and Lan Sha's body involuntarily hit the side of the tunnel, and she could not help but spit out a few bubbles. When she stabilized her body, she rubbed her forehead and tried to paddle with her arms. She probably wanted to speed up, but unexpectedly, she hit the tunnel that was close at hand again. Retracting his gaze from this clumsy scene, Tang Un was expressionless. At this moment, Tang In secretly swore that even if it was only for his own sake, he must make a pair of glasses for Lan Sha as soon as possible. Isn't this F*** cheating me? Chapter 639. Don't be afraid of a godlike enemy, but be afraid of a pig-like teammate. This was Tang Un's experience after seeing Lan Sha's clumsy behavior. Of course, this was a little unfair. After all, Lan Sha was born with myopia. Perhaps when the gods granted her supreme wisdom, they gave her such a weak shortcoming in order to leave other humans a way out. After some consideration, they gave her such a weak shortcoming. But no matter what, the current situation was that Lan Sha's efficient plan to escape first had failed, and Tang In could not hold on any longer. Yes, although it had been less than 3 minutes, Tang In was indeed feeling powerless. Perhaps this was the so-called dragon in shallow water is being toyed with by shrimps, by fish. If they were in open water, as long as there were enough of these strange fish, Tang In could only admit defeat no matter how strong he was. But now, in this narrow terrain that was easy to defend and difficult to attack, all the attacks came from one direction. If Tang In's injuries were healed, and he was in good condition, even if he could not kill all these strange fish, how could he be forced into such a difficult situation in such a short time? No, if this continues, not only will I not be able to pull away, but I will also very likely die here from exhaustion. Tang In frowned. His hands did not stop attacking, and his mind was also working frantically, hoping to find a way to get out of this deadlock. What are fish afraid of? Cats. Okay, this is ruled out. What do fish like? Do I have to cut off my shoulder and lure them away? Or cut Lan Sha's shoulder? No way. The wound will bleed, even if I cut it, well. But according to this line of thought, is there a normal bleeding that will not harm the body and can lure the strange fish away? Yeah, there seems to be one. Tang In subconsciously glanced at Lan Sha behind him, then smacked his lips, thinking about the Northern Wilderness Prince's menstrual cycle. Stop, stop, serious. It must be serious. Tang In shook his head, but before he could get rid of the various strange ideas in his mind, his almond-shaped pupils suddenly shrank. Within the scope of his vision, the shuttle-shaped water flow that was gradually thinning out suddenly increased. Furthermore, there were many faint bubbles rising from the periphery, and a black mass of shadows was rapidly swimming over. F***CK. After cursing, he quickly shut his mouth. After swallowing this mouthful of icy lake water, Tang Un's heart instantly turned cold. There was no doubt that Yema's body had been devoured clean. A large number of strange fish were gradually attracted by the smell of blood. Run. He had to admit that even though he knew that running wouldn't solve the root of the problem, he would eventually be caught by these strange fish. However, Tang In was indeed terrified at this moment. All he could think of was to flee. He was not a strange fish, but a human with 7 emotions and 6 desires. He could face death directly, but that didn't mean he could accept the miserable scene of thousands of fishes gnawing on his body. He opened his hands wide, and a small area of blood-red light suddenly erupted. Muffled thunders exploded in the surrounding waters, and the water flow suddenly became extremely chaotic. In particular, the whirlpools produced by the collision instantly covered the surrounding area. This wouldn't hurt many of the strange fish, but it could shake them off instantly. It was just a small eruption, but Tang In's tightly pursed lips were already faintly bleeding. However, he couldn't care less now. Seeing that the effect was good, he immediately turned around and prepared to run. However, just as he turned his head, Tang In's vision suddenly turned black. A huge black rock about 10 feet long and wide came crashing toward him. Further away, Lan Sha waved his hands and ran back with a panicked expression, and bubbles kept coming out of his mouth. He believed that if she could speak, she would be shouting a warning. After being slightly stunned, Tang In immediately realized that the long rock should have been accidentally flipped over by Lan Sha while he was stumbling. Then, due to the force of the water flow, he flew backward because of the weight. This stupid teammate. You're trying to kill me. And wait, a huge rock? A bolt of lightning suddenly flashed across his mind. Tang In's almond-shaped eyes suddenly lit up. He lowered his body and instantly slid close to the ground, avoiding the long rock that was rolling toward him. He turned his head, bang. Sure enough, the water rippled, and the long rock didn't deviate from the narrow part of the tunnel, blocking about half of the tunnel's area. I'll give you 32 likes. Hurriedly giving a thumbs up, Tang Un's impression of Lan Sha betraying his teammate instantly changed. He jumped up, and the short sword carried a violent, bloody aura as it fiercely stabbed at the surrounding mountain walls. Pooh! The power of the bloody aura was so overbearing that the rock walls that had been washed by the water flow for many years were easily pierced by the short sword like tofu. Chi! The short sword was dragged, and in an instant, a rectangular shape was drawn on the mountain wall again. His wrist shook. Tang In spat out a mouthful of blood, and the long rock wall in the tunnel smoothly slid down. Before the rock fell to the ground, the water flow carried it back again. Tang In didn't care that the temporarily suppressed injuries on his body were showing signs of erupting again. He rushed over just as the 2 huge rocks were about to hit each other. He waved his hand, and with a bang, the rolling rock instantly changed direction and fell into the gap in the narrow tunnel. With these 2 long rocks piled up, most of the tunnel was instantly blocked, and the rapid water flow suddenly slowed down. At this point, Tang In's purpose was obvious. He wanted to use the rocks to completely block the tunnel. In this way, the strange fish outside naturally wouldn't be a threat to them. It had to be said that although this method was simple, it seemed to be easy to think of. But in such an urgent situation, if it wasn't for Lan Shah's bad eyesight and unintentionally flipped the long rock with the help of the water flow, Tang In could only stare at it helplessly. If that's the case, well, myopia isn't without its benefits. As the saying goes, strike while the iron is hot. Seeing the dawn of hope in front of him, Tang In followed the remaining small gap and dragged the short sword around the surrounding mountain walls for a while. During this time, there were some strange fish that accidentally got in through the gap, but in a situation where they didn't have the advantage in numbers, Tang In naturally wasn't afraid and directly stomped them to death. Soon, like a jigsaw puzzle, Tang In blocked all the gaps that could be seen with the naked eye. Then, in order to prevent unforeseen events, he moved a huge rock door panel with difficulty to block behind, ensuring that nothing would go wrong. Clapping his hands, he looked left and right. It was a success, but even so, small ripples could still be seen faintly trembling around those huge rocks. Obviously, the large group of strange fish outside still didn't give up, and they were constantly hitting the rocks that blocked the way. This situation was also normal. Although Twain had blocked the passageway, it was impossible for him to not leave any gaps. Although these gaps were narrow and not enough for the strange fish to pass through, they could transmit the smell of blood inside. "Ha! Come and bite me again if you have the ability." He opened his mouth slightly and laughed silently. Tang In patted the huge rock. After narrowly escaping death, he was in a good mood. After provoking him like this, Tang In turned around and left with satisfaction. But then his feet suddenly stopped, and he was stunned to see Lan Shah in the distance floating in mid-air in the tunnel, his hands and feet dancing wildly, and a string of bubbles in his mouth. Was he short of breath? Tang In instantly reacted. Lan Shah was not like him. He had already mastered the internal breathing method in the system's training. As long as he didn't soak underwater for a day and a half, there was basically no shortage of oxygen. But Lan Shah couldn't do it. She didn't know martial arts. She originally thought that she could quickly pass through this tunnel under Tang In's lead, but she didn't expect that because of the strange fish, she would still be able to hold on until now. "Damn, I just praised you. And you almost said it earlier." Tang In complained bitterly as he rushed over. But he couldn't blame Lan Shah. They were underwater, just like how he couldn't warn her just now. How could Lan Shah call for help? In a few breaths, Tang In hurried over, jumped up, and hugged Lan Shah, who had begun to roll her eyes in midair. Then he was stunned. Saving people was like putting out a fire. Naturally, there was no room for hesitation. But Tang In didn't understand when he came just now. Now that he was hugging Lan Shah, he came back to his senses. How can I save her? It seems that there is only mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. After a short pause, Tang In touched his nose and thought, "Little girl, you can't blame me for this. I'm a serious person. I won't take advantage of others. You've earned a lot this time." With this thought, Tang In smacked his lips, leaned over, and kissed her. So soft. Her lips seemed to be fuller than Josiah's, but didn't have the faint fragrance of Josiah. There was only the taste of grilled fish. Tang In kissed two people in the other world. One was Josiah, and the other was Sylvia. Needless to say, he didn't taste the latter, so he subconsciously compared her with Josiah. Wait, why am I thinking about this? I'm a serious person. Breathe, breathe. Why are our tongues intertwined? This mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, this saving people, you can't use dirty thoughts to guess. Holy, do you understand? What a pure kiss, praising this world of love. P.S. Dear readers, happy Valentine's Day. Is this chapter appropriate? Carrot. Chapter 640. Which cat didn't want to steal fish? Since the bait had been delivered to his mouth, Tang In wouldn't be polite. Moreover, his dignity as a man wouldn't allow him to be pushed again. Wait, what did I say again? Tang In instantly threw away his doubts. He pressed one hand on the back of Lan Shah's head and the other hand on his waist. His tongue, which was previously in the base camp, quickly stretched out to track and harass the bold intruder. Because the field was extremely narrow, the intruder lost its initial sharpness after it had nowhere to escape and immediately retreated back to the base camp. But the defending side was already angered. Seeing that the enemy had the intention to retreat, they hurriedly chased after it. As one chased and one escaped, the flames of war instantly spread to the intruder's base camp. Just as the gate of the base camp was opened and closed, the intruder was finally caught temporarily. After that, although there were also some scattered and struggling movements, but after the defending side turned into the attacking side, the morale of the defending side was greatly boosted. In a short moment, it was completely blocked in a corner, and then it was surrounded and teased, fighting at close quarters. The battle was unprecedentedly fierce, making everyone's mouth dry and wanting to continue. Seeing that the internal battle had already set the tone of victory, the external forces suddenly became a little restless. The big hand on the waist slowly lifted and gently fell on the smooth, jade-like back of the shoulder. He paused, seeing that there was no intention of resistance. He slowly stroked down gently, as if he was wiping the naughty dust on a piece of white and flawless jade. The cycle repeated again and again. Twisting her delicate body, Lan Sha felt the throbbing on her back that was like being caressed by catkins. She pursed her lips and couldn't help but let out an unconscious moan. This feeling was very strange, although her rationality kept telling her that she shouldn't continue. Just like what she said before, once a man was aroused, he would turn into a beast and lose all rationality. But her body's senses were faintly resisting the command from the nerve center. She greedily enjoyed the wonderful stimulation brought by being caressed and couldn't stop. After all, Lan Sha was still inexperienced in this unfamiliar field and made the so-called darkness under the light mistake. She didn't know that not only men had lust, but women were no exception. Of course, it was undeniable that most women's lust was slower than men's. Yes, that was the case before the age of wolves and tigers. Lan Sha's situation was even more special. She was the princess of the Heavenly Wolf Empire, who ruled the northern wilderness for tens of thousands of miles. She was a bright pearl in the eyes of thousands of barbarians. Her every word and action was imitated and revered by countless people. At the same time, she was also placed under a magnifying glass, not allowing the slightest blasphemy. Under such circumstances, the high and mighty Lan Sha naturally found it difficult to come into contact with the so-called domain of the opposite sex. It could be said that if she were to openly fall in love, the other party would definitely be the product of a game between various parties, representing extremely huge interests. In other words, they had to get married. Very sad? No. From an objective point of view, this was actually very fair. Since he had enjoyed the noble status that countless people dreamed of, he naturally had to bear the corresponding consequences. There are gains and losses. This is the principle of fairness in the world. But now the situation was different, the other party was different, and the environment was also different. Lan Sha's love experience was like a blank piece of paper. When she met Tang Un, although he was not an experienced player, he was still an experienced veteran. Naturally, he would be slightly lost under all kinds of skills. Of course, this was not the most important factor. The most important thing was the current environment. This place was not under any magnifying glass, and there were no outsiders. Only Tang Un was a brand, and his life was still in her hands. There was no need to worry, no need to be on guard. It was precisely in this sudden blank period that Lan Sha put down her respected status and the pretense of majesty from time to time. At the same time, she temporarily got rid of the omnipresent pressure. She was naturally taken advantage of by Twain and gradually lost in the incessant stimulation of her senses. The tunnel was dim, the lake was calm, and it was as quiet as the sound of nature. Tanga did not think as complicated as Lan Sha. He only knew that there was a high mountain in front of him, and what he needed to do was to constantly explore the foothold and slowly climb until he reached the top of the mountain with his bare hands. Judging from the current situation, the exploration work was going smoothly. His big hands were patiently measuring every inch of the smooth, mirror-like shoulder and back, and he lingered. Because they were in the water, and Lan Sha took off her fox skin coat before entering the water, she was only wearing underwear now. This undoubtedly allowed Tang In to take advantage of her. When he caressed her, he could feel the smooth and soft skin of his palm without using any strength. It was hard to tell whether he was just brushing the water or brushing the water-like skin. It was really a kind of supreme enjoyment. However, it was a man's nature to be greedy. Whether it was a challenge factor or a greedy mentality, since Tang In was a normal man, he naturally could not escape this nature. After caressing Lan Sha's smooth and beautiful back again, Tang In did not repeat the action just now. Instead, after a slight pause, his palms slowly slid down, crossing a soul-stirring gully and slowly climbing to the soft hill that was gradually bulging in. With a muffled groan, as if he was stung by a scorpion, Tang In's upper body instantly leaned back. At the same time, he regretfully withdrew his big hand, raised it, and wiped his lips. A few drops of blood floated out from his fingertips, and then instantly dissipated into the cold lake water. And what disappeared with it was the previous crimson atmosphere. "Little girl, you are really ruthless." Smacking his lips, Tang In felt the blood in his mouth that did not disperse, and could not help but stare at Lan Sha in front of him. However, Lan Sha did not have the apologetic attitude that she should have after hurting someone. Instead, she opened her beautiful eyes and stared back at him with the same imposing manner. Although communication was not smooth, Lan Sha was still in Tang In's arms, and the hands around Tang In's neck did not have any intention of letting go. After a few seconds of stalemate, Lan Sha made a gesture to move forward and then lowered her eyes, looking like a koala bear that was lazing around here. Tang In was stunned at first, and then he could not help but curl his lips. In his heart, although he did not know the length of the tunnel, he certainly did not want to leave here with Lan Sha so quickly. Tang In also vaguely knew that once they left here, the intelligent and decisive highness of the northern wilderness would return once again. Thinking of this, Tang In's eyes flashed slightly, and he carried Lan Sha horizontally. This could be considered a true princess carry, and he walked forward at a steady pace. Of course, this was not the speed that Tang In should have. Even if they were in the water, as long as Tang In wanted to, his running speed would still be more than 10 times faster than his current speed. And the current strange situation, needless to say, was obvious. Just by looking at how Tang In walked while glancing at Lan Sha's attitude from the corner of his eyes, one could tell that this was a very strong attempt to test her. Lan Sha was very intelligent, and she immediately noticed Tang In walking slowly for more than 10 seconds. Her narrowed eyes suddenly widened, and she glanced at Tang In with a gaze that was as sharp as a knife. Cough, cough. After spitting out 2 huge bubbles, Tang In raised his head slightly and looked away with a blank and innocent expression. Of course, the muscles in his arms were already slowly tensing, and he was ready to throw Lan Sha out if he felt that the situation was not right. Oof. Lan Sha's nose trembled, and a few bubbles slipped out from the tip of her small nose. The sharpness in her eyes gradually disappeared, and she lowered her eyes again, not saying a word about Tang In's actions. There were many meanings of silence, silent resistance, disdain, acquiescence, and now, this silence undoubtedly meant acquiescence. Or rather, Tang In was more willing to understand it as acquiescence. Grinning, Tang In laughed silently, and his expression was very excited. He could have sworn that he had never seen a more inspiring silence than this. I should celebrate, Tang In thought, and then he simply lowered his head, and once again kissed the soft lips that were close to him. Lan Sha did not struggle too much. The temptation to resist was not something that she could use flexibly at this stage. After she planned her bottom line in her heart, she awkwardly responded to the attack from above. I'll just treat it as a short dream. This feeling is not bad. Because of the walking, the lake that had gradually calmed down began to flow slowly again, sparkling and undulating, reflecting on the mountain walls on both sides. The light was dim, mottled, and intertwined. It looked like a ball of flame, mixed with two figures tightly hugging each other, bringing a trace of warmth to the icy lake. Chapter 641. P.S. Since it's a piece of content, I might as well finish it in one chapter. There's no need to separate it to get clicks. His character is perfect. Carrot, carrot. No one knows the passage of time in the cave. Only dreams remain in the water. Let's temporarily shift our attention away from Tang and turn back to Mountain Stream City, to the place where the storm is brewing at noon in the meeting room of the tavern by the stream. It was supposed to be dinner time, but because of a few sudden incidents, the middle and high-ranking members of the secret organization were constantly gathering here. Soon, dozens of people, standing or sitting, filled up the hall. It could be seen that other than the higher-ups sitting in the middle, most of the people standing next to them were puzzled. However, looking at the silence of the upper echelons, it was not good for them to ask anything for the time being. Of course, since it was a meeting between acquaintances, it was inevitable that they would greet each other. After a brief discussion, they shook their heads, seemingly unable to make sense of the matter. Among them, from time to time, there would be people who would cast their gazes at the head of the hall, at the beautiful figure who sat quietly and calmly. Putting everything else aside, just from the lively scene, it was clear that the secret organization was no longer the shabby group they were when they negotiated with Bran. In the early stages of a team's development, the person who could cause such a shocking change was usually the highest leader. Naturally, the secret agency was no exception. Her innate ability to lead, her skills were becoming more and more handy, and her unswerving initial dream. Joshua, this young noble girl from a small town in the south, was growing at an astonishing speed after going through a series of trials and tribulations. Of course, the large sum of money that Tang had invested previously also played a strong role in this. It was precisely because of the convergence of many factors that Josiah finally showed her dazzling brilliance. In a short period of time, she had completely broken through the bottleneck of the secret agency. Soon, there were no more people entering the main gate. Most of the higher-ups in the headquarters of Mountain Stream City and the surrounding cities had gathered. Looking around, Josiah frowned slightly. He did not immediately announce the start of the meeting. Instead, he summoned his trusted aide behind him and asked in a low voice, "Go and ask why Uncle Enoch hasn't arrived yet." Yes, Enoch, Borg's third uncle, was also the person with the highest status in the secret organization other than Josiah. Of course, that was in the past. The situation now was somewhat different. After being reminded by Tang and understanding the special mission of the secret organization, Josiah took back the right to gather information from Enoch. Then, as the organization continued to expand, it was inevitable that some young executives would be promoted. As a result, although Enoch was still the number 2 person in the organization in name, the power in his hands was much less than before. Of course, these actions would make Enoch very dissatisfied, but this was also human nature. But no matter what, as the second in command of the organization, he had to attend this meeting. Unexpectedly, after a while, the trusted aide came back and whispered, "Commander, Lord Enoch and Officer Borg left the city 4 days ago. They said that they have important matters to attend to in Dawn City." You left for 4 days? Josiah frowned slightly when he heard this. Of course, there was no problem in returning to the city of Dawn. That was no longer the place that the brand had described. However, they had already been gone for 4 days. As the person in charge of the organization, he did not know anything about it. This was undoubtedly a little unreasonable. Was he deliberately hiding it? But why? It was just a small doubt, but Josiah immediately cast it aside. He looked around at the crowd and knocked on the table. Tap, tap, tap. The low voices of discussion dissipated, and the room suddenly became silent. He took a breath and said calmly, "This time, I've gathered everyone here because of some information that I've received over the past few days. Something is not right. Maybe I'm making a fuss over nothing, but I hope so." Josiah wanted to say something, but he was worried that it would affect everyone's judgment. In the end, he did not say anything. He only gestured to a young man beside him. This young man was called Dave. When the people from the Twilight Hunter team came to kill them, he had interacted with Tang In and secretly became a love rival for a period of time. However, later on, Dave gave up on the idea of pursuing Josiah and focused on managing the organization's affairs. Now, he had become Josiah's right-hand man and a high-ranking executive of a secret organization. Ahem. Standing up, Dave coughed twice and picked up a few pieces of paper. This information is more trivial. Let's listen to it first. The first one is from the Thunderbolts Army's Tui City branch in the frontline defense area. Recently, part of the Thunderbolts Army's forces have been frequently mobilized, faintly forming a blockade around Tui City. The 6,000 soldiers of our army that have not had time to retreat are stationed here. The day before yesterday, the defense of the surrounding cities of Wallen, Bewley, and a few other 100,000 mountains increased sharply. The city gates were under martial law, and passers-by were strictly searched. Yesterday, in the Silent Hall, Dave sorted out the information that had been received over the past few days and spent about 10 minutes reading it out. Gradually, the atmosphere became a little oppressive. The expressions of the high-ranking executives in the surrounding organizations changed slightly. As they looked at each other, most of them saw the same expression on each other's faces, bewildered. If one looked at the information individually, there was of course no problem. Or even if there was a problem, it was impossible for people to quickly connect the dots. However, after a little integration, listening to the sudden changes that had occurred in the past few days, people could not help but think of a terrifying possibility in their hearts. First, the front line. With the retreat of the barbarians in the northern wilderness, the frontline battle had ended dozens of days ago. As for the Gray Coat Army, as a collaborator, naturally, they had to withdraw after receiving the commendation from the brand's military headquarters. However, this was not the case. The brand was very evasive about the withdrawal procedures and did not allow a large number of Gray Coat Army soldiers to withdraw. Of course, given that the brand had always been a procrastinator, the Gray Coat Army did not think much about this. They only organized the injured soldiers and the scattered small teams to withdraw and continued to negotiate with the other party for the rest. However, now that everyone had heard about the brand's army that was faintly surrounding them, and combined with the previous situation, they suddenly felt a sense of danger in their hearts moreover. Due to the reconciliation between the two sides and the fact that Rosa was a member of the parliament, the brand would naturally not restrict the position of the City of Dawn as strongly as before. It could be said that the roads leading to the City of Dawn from the surrounding cities in the 100,000 mountains were unobstructed. Although there was still a limit on the number of people who could enter the City of Dawn, there was still a lot of slandering, intimidation, and other small tricks that could not be used in public. At least, normal travel was not affected. Some merchant teams had also started to test the waters by transporting goods to the City of Dawn, hoping to open up a new trade route. It was full of vitality, and everything was developing in a good direction. However, now the surrounding cities had suddenly sealed off the roads and entered a state of martial law. The meaning behind this was worth pondering. No, it can't be that the brand is going to attack us. In the oppressive atmosphere, a middle-level personnel subconsciously muttered. His voice was not loud, but in this silent hall, it was transmitted into everyone's ears. Almost everyone's body shook when they heard this. How could this guess not be what they were thinking in their hearts? It can't be. Although the greedy maggots in the brand's palace are quite shameless. How many days has it been since the news of this cooperation was announced to the world? Are they slapping themselves in the face so soon? This was someone who could not believe it and subconsciously rebut it. This is hard to say, but if the other party has a reason or an excuse, this was someone who was preparing for the worst and was making rational guesses. Bullsh * T reason. I think this group of bastards wants to burn the bridge after crossing the river. This was someone who was impulsive, if that's the case. Amidst the gradual discussion, a middle-aged man who was standing at the periphery frowned. The garrison troops of my city suddenly left the city a few days ago in the direction of the 100,000 mountains. Could it be, when he thought of the sudden increase in the garrison troops of the cities around the 100,000 mountains, the middle-aged man was stunned and speechless. At the same time, a few similar voices were heard. It's the same in my city, but I didn't pay attention at that time. It's the same here. F***CK. I left the city with the garrison troops this morning. The people who spoke were middle-level managers of the secret organization. They were also the backbone of the organization. They played the role of the person in charge of the branch organizations in their respective cities. When these people spoke, there was a sudden commotion. There was no doubt that the brand was preparing for something big, and it was very likely that they were coming for them. Quiet. Dave slammed the table and looked at Josiah, who was still frowning in deep thought. He said, "The headquarters guess is similar to everyone's thoughts. The key question now is, why did the brand do this? Or rather, why did they dare to do this? I wonder if anyone has received any news about this." Just like what the rational person said, it had been less than half a year since the brand and the Gray Coat Army announced their cooperation. Both sides were in the honeymoon period, and there were no irreconcilable conflicts on the surface. Therefore, the reason why the brand was in a hurry to make a move did not make sense. Of course, the possibility of burning the bridge after crossing the river could not be ruled out, but it was also the lowest possibility. This was because the Gray Coat Army was not a simple individual, but was closely tied to the new noble forces of the empire. To make an inappropriate comparison, the person standing behind them was the second prince of the empire. This was related to the fight for the throne. Even if it was only for the sake of the votes of the three counselors, the new noble forces would not let the Gray Coat Army be burned after crossing the river. But now, the brand's frequent movements were a fact, but there was no news from the new nobles. This undoubtedly added a layer of fog to this matter. It made Josiah and the others even more confused about the situation. After a while, unfortunately, even though all the middle and high-level personnel gathered here in the shortest time possible, no one could think of a piece of information that was important enough for the new nobles of the brand to be willing to abandon the Gray Coat Army. Where is the fuse? Rubbing his forehead, Josiah filtered through all the recent information in his mind, but he still could not figure it out. While thinking, for some reason, Josiah suddenly remembered Enoch's sudden departure. Of course, there was no connection between the two, or at least Josiah could not make the connection. But perhaps it was because Enoch had deliberately concealed the time of his departure, or because he had done too much intelligence work. Josiah felt that Enoch had left at a bad time. Commander. Oh. Looking up and seeing Dave's worried expression, Josiah nodded slightly and took a deep breath. He quickly sorted out his thoughts and said calmly, "Pass down the order. Send someone to deliver this information to Dawn City. Also, continue to investigate." Creak. Before he finished speaking, the door of the meeting room was pushed open. The middle-aged man, disguised as the tavern owner, hurried in and met Josiah's gaze. He bowed and said, "Commander, there are two people outside the tavern who urgently want to see you. They say they have something important to report." Josiah frowned slightly when he heard this. Obviously, this was not the time to meet guests. The middle-aged man continued. "They said their names are Jack and Carol." The meeting was temporarily suspended. Dave led everyone to continue thinking about the damned fuse. Josiah had already reached the front of the tavern, but just as he stepped into the main hall of the tavern from the back door, he saw two figures, one tall and one short, in front of the counter and could not help but be stunned. The taller one was an old man with white hair. His back was slightly bent, and he wore a navy blue short shirt that had been washed until it was white. He stood in a reserved posture, like a country bumpkin who had just entered the city for the first time. The shorter one was a young man with a grayish-white cloth wrapped around his head. There was some dirt on his face, and his body was very thin and weak, as if he was malnourished. When the two of them stood together, the first impression they gave was that they were a grandfather and grandson from the countryside who had come to seek refuge with relatives in the city. And the following scene undoubtedly proved this point. Under the gazes of the customers in the tavern in twos and threes, the white-haired old man turned his head. When he saw Josiah, his eyes instantly lit up, and the wrinkles on his face trembled slightly. He staggered over with an excited expression. "Tigress, I've finally found you, Pooh." A certain customer looked at the white-robed Josiah, who, although disguised, still had a delicate face. In the end, he could not accept this domineering title, and opened his mouth to spit out a large mouthful of wine. Looking at this white-haired old man who was making covert eye signals in a wretched manner that was seriously inconsistent with his age, the corner of Joshua's mouth twitched, but he still went up to him with a face full of surprise. "Grandfather? Younger brother? Why are you here?" "Sigh, don't mention it. The land is barren, and the food is not enough for your little brother Urgu to eat." "Urgu? Cough, cough, grandfather. Let's talk outside. Let's talk outside." Pulling and pulling, Josiah dragged the white-haired old man out of the tavern's main hall, and the young man called Urgu followed expressionlessly at the side. Not long after they left the main hall, the white-haired old man's eyes darted around, and he looked at the surroundings. Then he bowed slightly, and his body miraculously straightened. He grabbed Josiah's arm tightly, tears flowing down his old face. "F***, I finally found a group. Let's not talk about it first. Find me a doctor first, then find me a bed. Oh, and hurry up and bring me some food now. I haven't eaten for 2 days." Josiah was stunned when he heard this. Then he touched the cloth on the young man's head and said, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, "What is this? Jack, little Carol, why are you dressed up like this? Also, little Carol, where have you been all this time? Why are you together with Jack?" Needless to say, this pair of grandfather and granddaughter was naturally Jack and little Carol. As for why he had to disguise himself like this, and even muddle along to the point where he hadn't eaten for 2 days, it was truly a sad story. They had come to Mountain Stream City to find Josiah once before, but at that time, Josiah had already gone to the front lines. For little Carol, this was naturally killing 2 birds with 1 stone. After all, she originally wanted to go to the front lines to find Big Brother Tang Yin. And as Tang Yin's bad friend, Jack naturally couldn't watch little Carol, a half-grown girl, go to the front lines alone to find him. He could only give up on the plan to return to the southern city and accompany little Carol. But then, something happened. They saved the teacher from the Commoner Academy, and then inexplicably offended the Temple of Light, completely messing up their plans. Temple of Light. Just from a name, one could tell what kind of image this organization had. But now that Jack and little Carol had seen this dirty scene, they naturally wanted to silence them. At this point, the two's plan to go to the front lines was undoubtedly ruined. The most important thing now was to hide and not be caught by the Temple of Light. But was the Temple of Light actually so easy to provoke? Even if they couldn't openly arrest Jack and little Carol due to various reasons, once this huge machine was activated, its forces would instantly cover the area and encircle the 2 of them in a certain area for careful investigation. Only little Carol had learned Tang Yin's secret art of running away. She quickly created all kinds of disguises and changed her appearance, avoiding the search teams in the open and in the dark. Of course, little Carol was still young after all. Her technical level might be enough, but her experience was still too shallow. If she was alone and was stopped by someone to ask her a few questions, she would definitely be exposed. Fortunately, she had the old fox Jack by her side. With the many disguises provided by little Carol, he constantly changed his identity and could always use actions and words that matched his identity to deal with all kinds of traveling expenses. If he was forced into a corner, he could even sneak into a noble's manor with little Carol and openly appear as a servant. Of course, the Temple of Light's influence was too great. Even if they weren't found on the spot, they would be blocked in some suspicious place. But fortunately, the Temple of Light's headquarters wasn't here, and most of the experts here had been transferred to the front lines to participate in the war. So if there was no other choice, Jack and little Carol's strength could still guarantee that they could temporarily break out of the encirclement. It was during this escape that Jack and little Carol discussed and decided to return to Mountain Stream City first. This was because the closest helper they knew was in this city. Secondly, because Mountain Stream City was the holy city of the North, the pursuers definitely wouldn't think that they would dare to break into this place. The so-called most dangerous place was also the safest place. This was the principle. The tragic process didn't need to be described in detail. Perhaps it could be seen from Jack's request for a doctor, a bed, and food. Sister Shay, the process is too long. I'll tell you when I have time. Little Carol bowed politely to Joshua, then frowned and looked at the dispirited Jack. Brother Jack, you forgot that there's still one important thing you haven't said. Oh, that's right, look at my brain. I've gone crazy from all the running. Jack slapped his forehead and said anxiously, Josiah, hurry up and inform your people and the people from the City of Dawn to run. Oh no, hurry up and be on guard. The people from the Temple of Light are coming. What? Josiah's expression changed drastically when he heard this. He exclaimed, What's going on? It's too troublesome to explain. We've been chased by the people from the Temple of Light for some time. Don't ask why. Wait for me to finish. Jack waved his hand and stopped Josiah, who was a little stunned by this shocking news. He continued, Then, a few days ago, we suddenly discovered that the hunting teams behind us had all disappeared. Even some of the important road checkpoints were not searched. This situation was obviously abnormal. We were worried that the other party was up to something again, so we boldly turned back and followed a hunting team, wanting to eavesdrop on the specific situation. After a pause, Jack's expression darkened. Then we discovered that these people were holding a portrait of Tang in their hands. Yes, it's very similar. To be precise, they were talking about Tangen's name, identity, and so on. They quickly gathered at a place, discussing how to mobilize their forces to completely annihilate the Gray Code Army. A portrait of Tang Yin? They can even accurately say his name and identity? How is that possible? The wanted portrait of the Temple of Light is clearly Tang, in disguise. Isn't that the case? Or was there someone? Enoch took Borg out of the city 4 days ago. The fuse that made the new aristocratic forces not dare to leak the news, the Temple of Light. Bang! With a heavy hammer and a lot of previous information combined, the fog in front of Josiah suddenly cleared up. However, it did not bring him relief, but an instant livid expression. He roared angrily, Someone call all the guards regarding the meeting hall a few days ago. Everything happened suddenly in the past few days, and it just happened that a few days ago, Josiah got the news about Tang in the meeting hall. So, if it wasn't for something wrong with her confidant and leaking the news, then someone must have eavesdropped on her conversation that day. Chapter 642. At the same time, an impromptu meeting was also taking place somewhere. However, the meeting had already ended. The wooden door of the simple hut opened, and groups of people filed out in 2s and 3s with relaxed expressions and laughter. Minister Bosco, thank you for your unique insight this time. Otherwise, we might have fallen into the trap of those greedy guys. You flatter me. I just thought of it occasionally. Hey, Minister Bosco, you don't have to be modest anymore. Once is occasionally, but twice or thrice is still the same. That's right. Although those greedy guys of the new aristocrats are now in a cooperative relationship with us, they haven't stopped stabbing us in the back. Every time they want us to be cannon fodder, do they really think everyone is a fool? Fortunately, we have Minister Bosco. Oh no, it's Senator Bosco. Please don't laugh at me. The chatter that carried a hint of admiration and flattery continued, and the target of everyone's praise was the curly-haired old man who stood in the crowd, waving his hand from time to time. He had a modest expression and a calm posture, and he carried the demeanor of a low-key wise man. After chatting for a while, a middle-aged man hurried over and stood at the periphery looking at the curly-haired old man with an anxious expression. Only then did everyone politely salute and say goodbye. A few days ago, a new tavern opened in the east of the city. I heard that there is an ancestral brew with a unique taste. Minister Bosco, how about we go and have a drink together sometime? I can use this opportunity to ask about something. Oh, ancestral brew? It's all thanks to you. I'm going to try it. That's settled then. I'll send someone to inform you of the specific time. Okay, then I won't stand on ceremony. In the laughter, Bosco warmly bid farewell to the last person. The smile on his face didn't disappear as he turned to look at the middle-aged man who had been waiting by the side. The latter understood and came forward. He was probably a member of the Bosco family, and he reported with a salute, "Master, Enoch and young Master Borg are back, and they urgently want to see you." Bosco was slightly startled when he heard this, and then he couldn't help but frown with a gloomy face. "Borg? That idiot. He finally dares to come back?" Bosco had naturally heard about what Borg had done in the front line. Although it was impossible to know the specific cause and effect, it was an indisputable fact that Borg had fought with Michaud and was sent back. As such, Bosco was undoubtedly infuriated by Borg's irrational act of destroying his own future. It could be said that if Enoch had not intercepted Borg in time and brought him to Mountain Stream City, Bosco would have definitely taught Borg a lesson in his rage. However, it had been a few days since the incident. Although Bosco was also angry when he heard that Borg had returned, he still suppressed his anger. With a wave of his hand, Zhang Xian didn't think too much about it as he headed back to the residence of the Zhang clan. To be in such a hurry to meet me and even invite Enoch back, was he afraid that I would make a move on him? What a good-for-nothing. With this thought in mind, Bosco couldn't help but be a little angry at Borg for not fighting for his position as the sole heir. However, this anger was soon covered up by his good mood. Bosco had been in a good mood ever since he received his identity as a member of the parliament a few months ago. This feeling of joy was even more intense and exciting than the greatest achievement in his life, which was to promote his family from a baron to a viscount more than a decade ago by relying on smuggling profits. He was so excited that he could not control his emotions. It was not only because he had surpassed his previous status, but also because of the heavy sense of accomplishment in his heart. Since his family had been exposed and wiped out, although he had decisively fled, there were basically no casualties among his clansmen. However, they were still at a loss for the unknown future, as well as the drop in status from noble nobles to wanted criminals that couldn't be tolerated by the world, which inevitably caused everyone in the clan to be in a state of panic. It was also at that time that he chose to rely on the Grey Coat Army. To be honest, the reason why Bosco made this decision was mainly because he had no other way out. The rest was just a little bit of unwillingness. He was unwilling to accept the fact that his family had fallen apart in his hands for hundreds of years. His clansmen had been scattered everywhere, hiding everywhere. This was the greatest insult to his family's glory. Fortunately, such a situation didn't happen after that. After joining the Grey Coat Army, his family was temporarily intact, and he, the former Viscount Bosco, also became the leader of the rebels in a very short period of time. Although the promotion speed was a little fast, it was actually not unexpected. It was just that the result was a little ironic. Losha was a sensible person. He knew that he was much more useful than those civilians who had just thrown away their farming tools and picked up knives and only knew how to fight and kill. Moreover, he had a complete Viscount family behind him. Although he was chased like a stray dog, he still had his foundation and didn't lack talents in all aspects. As long as Losha wanted to expand the Grey Coat Army, then his family's role couldn't be ignored, and that was the truth. Very quickly, under one ruthless or flexible method after another, meritorious contributions came one after another. The hardships involved, as well as the price the family had to pay in blood, were not known to outsiders, and there was no need to talk about them in detail. Because all these sacrifices were worth it, the family finally had a firm foothold in the Grey Coat Army, and they were gradually recognized and respected by the commoners. His position also rose along with the tide, and he became one of the higher-ups, second only to Rosa. Of course, his identity changed from the leader of the rebels to the leader of the rebels. There was really nothing to be proud of. To be honest, at that time, Bosco had thought of betraying. Although this idea was a little shameless, it was actually reasonable. Bosco, who had been immersed in the aristocratic circle all his life, didn't think that he would have a sense of belonging to the Grey Coat Army just because he had stayed here for a while. What he yearned for was a dignified identity that stood under the sun. And with his status at that time, it was enough for him to come into contact with all aspects of the Grey Coat Army, so he still had the chips to betray them. He believed that the Brand Kingdom's hatred towards him, an insignificant smuggling noble, was not as deep as the Grey Cloth Army, a group that gave them headaches from time to time. But after thinking about it for a night, he finally resisted this tempting idea because he felt that the potential of the Grey Coat Army had not been fully explored, or it could be said that it was not enough to give the Brand Kingdom more headaches. Just like a commodity, before its value was fully realized, it would be unwise to rush to sell it. Following that, the sudden change in the Grey Cloth Army undoubtedly proved his point of view. In fact, it had greatly exceeded his expectations. First, they took hostages to force the people from the Brand Kingdom to come to negotiate. There was also a small episode, which was that a few of the nobles in the capital invited him for tea and promised to restore his status as a viscount in exchange for his betrayal. At that time, Bosco chose to directly refuse because his vision had become more far-sighted, and this episode undoubtedly gave him a reassurance. From then on, he was very sure that he indeed had a good card in his hand later. The Grey Coat Army ushered in an unprecedented period of development. The number of people who came to join them kept increasing, and the framework of all aspects was gradually perfected. They even had their own base camp and built a majestic city. These rapid changes made him a little dizzy. Vaguely, he saw a shortcut to reach the peak of his family's glory without betraying or relying on the Brand Kingdom. Sure enough, there were 2 consecutive battles. Under Dawn City, they destroyed the Brand army that came to invade them, and they became famous. Then, they led the army out of the 100,000 mountains, and they won every battle, and they went straight to the surrounding cities. At that time, Bosco was shocked to realize that their current strength was not only enough to give the Brand Kingdom a headache, but also enough to really hurt this huge monster. The commodity had become a peerless weapon, and it was the kind that could be upgraded. This huge difference brought Bosco great surprise. Then, the status of a counselor brought about by the negotiation made Bosco feel like he was sitting at home, and gold coins fell from the sky. Of the 3 counselors, Losha would definitely get one. As for the other 2, Bosco's family had made great contributions in the past, and he had supported Losha's decision to not attack Baran City during the critical period, so he finally got one. Counselor Ha. Although it had been a long time since he was conferred the title, Bosco still felt that it was very dreamy, and he was very excited. Such a high status. Not to mention now, even when he was a viscount, he didn't even dare to think about it. There were countless nobles and ancient families in the Brand Kingdom, but how many of them could get this title? Finally, he got it. Above, this experience could be called a legend. Putting aside the evaluation, Bosco had led his family through a bloody journey, and he was indeed qualified to enjoy the heavy sense of accomplishment and be proud of it. Of course, this was just the beginning, and there was still a long way to go. However, Bosco was very confident now, and he planned to bring his family to the peak of glory in his old age, so that future generations would admire him. This statement was not false. It was a real goal that could be reached, and it was the Grey Coat Army itself that provided the ladder to the top. It was not an exaggeration to say that the Grey Coat Army now could not do without Bosco. Just now, the counselors had the right to vote on important matters of the kingdom, and because of the special status of the Grey Coat Army, Rosa and the others naturally couldn't go to the capital of the kingdom to vote. That would be like sending sheep to the tiger's mouth. So whenever there was an important matter that needed to be discussed, the capital would send the relevant documents to the counselors, and then they would decide and vote. For this reason, the kingdom's Magicaster Guild specially built a long-distance teleportation portal in a city near the 100,000 mountains. Oh, to digress, Bran originally wanted to build this teleportation portal in the City of Dawn, but Rosa and the others didn't agree, and naturally everyone knew the reason. Back to the topic, since there was something to convey, the higher-ups of the Grey Coat Army naturally had to discuss it. Of course, in the first few votes, Rosa and the others agreed with the suggestions from the new aristocrats, and they were more or less following the trend. Of course, this didn't mean that they had deviated from the principles of the Gray Coat Army and wallowed in the mire with the aristocrats. It was the first time that all the higher-ups, including Rosa, had come into contact with these complicated matters, and they didn't know how to proceed. They could only vote in agreement while carefully studying these matters, and they were in a state of learning. And this was the limitation of a civilian group like the Gray Coat Army. Most of the higher-ups could basically use simple and crude words to arouse the enthusiasm of tens of thousands of civilian soldiers. But when faced with the official words on the luxurious parchment, they couldn't even read them smoothly and could only stare blankly and helplessly. And in a situation where they couldn't even understand the literal meaning, naturally, they couldn't understand the complicated interest behind and put forward any constructive suggestions. This status quo, which was determined by their background, was almost an insurmountable chasm. Among them, only Rosa's situation was better. She was born in a noble family and more or less knew the tricks in the noble circle. And more importantly, her years of practical management experience of leading a team was enough to let her avoid some traps and face the essence of the problem directly, even if she couldn't understand it at the moment. But unfortunately, she was only one person. There was a limit to human power. She could not organize the trivial and detailed data while thinking about the meaning behind each detail and at the same time make accurate decisions. This task was too big, and her companions who had only taken care of the vegetable garden and the sheep before could not help her in any way. At this time, Bosco's role was undoubtedly infinitely magnified. No matter what, Bosco was a viscount, the head of a family, and had been immersed in the circle of nobles all year round. Although he couldn't completely understand the words and things that he was familiar with, his years of experience were enough for him to translate these official words and things to the greatest extent in vernacular, as well as note the various interests behind them. Of course, this move was unanimously praised by the higher-ups who were confused by this thing, and thus, the scene of flattery after the meeting just now happened. To be honest, Bosco looked down on these higher-ups before and now. In the entire Gray Coat Army, only Rosa made him a little afraid. But Rosa walked forward unhurriedly. Bosco squinted his old eyes and gently shook his head. He still wasn't optimistic about the future of the Gray Coat Army, because he was too clear about the means of those big nobles. Even now, the new noble forces that had close ties with the Gray Coat Army treated them politely because the current Gray Coat Army was still valuable to them. But in essence, they still despised the Gray Coat Army. The fundamental contradiction between the two sides hadn't been eliminated, and it would erupt one day. But what does this have to do with me? The corner of Bosco's mouth twitched, and he sneered. The possibility of a conflict was still very far away, but he had already planned for it. After dealing with the Gray Coat Army, he would set his sights on the higher-ups of the brand. With his identity as a counselor, no matter where he went, there was basically no obstruction. With this foundation, it was only a matter of time before he created a network that belonged to him. Then, he would slowly clear his identity as a member of the Gray Coat Army and officially enter the higher-ups of the brand. Everything was ready, and there was a lot to be done. Bosco was reminiscing about the past and thinking about the future. He was slightly proud and complacent, but he didn't know that his destination, which was a person in the family residence, threw his painstaking efforts to the ground, jumped up and stepped on it a few times until it was smashed into pieces. Remember, no matter how Big Brother reacts, even if he hits you, you're not allowed to defend yourself. Just kneel here and lower your head. Don't worry, I'm here, you won't die. As for the rest, sigh. I can only help you this much. In the hall, Enoch walked around anxiously, and from time to time, he thought of something and immediately instructed Borg, who was kneeling in the middle of the hall. Yes, third uncle. But Borg, who was in a daze, nodded subconsciously, and then grabbed his hair innocently and confusedly. Why is this so? A few days ago, just when he was drunk and complacently told his third uncle Enoch what he had done, he saw Enoch standing there for a long time. Then he came back to his senses and dragged him into the carriage with a livid face. Without saying anything, he left the city in the middle of the night and went straight to Dawn City. Along the way, Enoch went out to do some things, and Borg was guarded in the carriage by a few masters in the family. They only met again when they were outside Dawn City. For a few days, Borg did not receive any explanation and was foolishly brought here. Then, he had to kneel down and listen to his third uncle's earnest instructions. He felt helpless and innocent. What was going on? IF Asterisk King told you not to ask. Enoch suddenly roared and waved his arms. His expression was slightly ferocious. Then, like a deflated balloon, he bent down and squatted in front of Borg. He licked his dry lips and smiled bitterly. You're in big trouble this time. Big trouble? Just because I revealed Tang Un's portrait and identity to the Temple of Light? The more Borg listened, the more confused he became. He looked at his third uncle, whose face was full of bitterness, and carefully probed. Are you worried about revenge? Gray Space? Or Leader Rosa? Don't worry, I'm not that stupid. I've already killed the painter who drew the portrait. The one who passed the information was Child. He handled it very well and did not leave any traces. Tang In, Tang In, Tang In. Do you only have eyes for Tang In? Rubbing his forehead, Enoch sighed helplessly. Sigh, actually it's our fault. We didn't tell you the details. Do you think that Big Brother and I don't know that Tang In wants to kill the people of the Temple of Light? We actually knew about it long ago. So did the others, including Rosa. Let's put it this way. Although Tang In did not say it explicitly, from the information that he casually revealed several times, he did not intend to hide it at all. Because if we can't stop him, then we can only help him hide it. WHY? Because the Temple of Light can't be provoked, especially our Gray Code army. We can't let them have any big evidence against us. The reason for this is very complicated. Big Brother should be clear about it. I only know half of it and can't explain it clearly. Anyway, pause for a while. Enoch looked at Borg, whose face was gradually showing signs of fear. He shook his head and sighed. You think that this time, you've only framed Tang In. In fact, you've dragged our family and the entire Gray Code army into the water with you. In the silent hall, the soft sigh slowly reverberated until it disappeared without a trace. Bam! Borg's body went limp and he sat on the ground. He trembled slightly and his face was pale. After a moment, a sobbing voice sounded. Third uncle, save me. Chapter 643. In the hall, the doors and windows were tightly closed, causing the place to be plunged into a dark and gloomy atmosphere. Enoch must have considered the possibility of what might happen next, as he had already cleared the surroundings of the hall and no one could be seen walking around. The three figures in the hall were either sitting, standing, or kneeling. They were motionless like statues and did not make any sound. The atmosphere was as cold as ice and as cold as water. This state had been maintained for a long time. It had been like this ever since Bosco returned and listened to Enoch's report. The tea that was placed on the table and gradually cooled down without a trace of smoke could prove this point. There was no expected storm of cursing and beating. Bosco sat quietly on the wooden chair with his back leaning against the back of the chair, looking a little powerless. His expression was still calm, but the wrinkles on his old face twitched from time to time. His eyes were dull and melancholy, as if he was watching something beautiful pass away. Regret, helplessness, such a situation was of course abnormal. Although there was no violence, this kind of brewing attitude was like thunder hidden behind dark clouds, undoubtedly pushing the situation to a more serious direction. Seeing that something was wrong, Enoch coughed a few times and took the lead to break the silence in the room. He knew his big brother Bosco too well. If this continued, Borg would really be finished. After hesitating for a while, he said, "Big brother, in fact, this matter is not entirely Borg's fault. Of course, he was a little reckless, but we are also responsible." Borg couldn't help but look a little happy when he heard this, but he still didn't dare to make any moves. He lowered his head and kneeled obediently. If we could have told him the situation inside earlier. Bosco raised his hand slightly, and Enoch's persuasion stopped abruptly. Bosco crossed his two palms that were covered with old age spots and squeezed them. He looked at Borg and said, "So, you've told him Tangen's name, identity, and position in the Grey Coat Army?" Hmm. Borg's lips moved as if he wanted to explain something, but when he thought of Enoch's previous instructions, he just nodded in the end. Good, good. Bosco's old eyes narrowed with a complicated expression as he praised in an ambiguous tone. Everyone has worked hard for so many years to put the fate of the entire clan on the line. In the end, it was all for naught. Borg, oh Borg, you've finally done something big. Hearing this, Enoch was startled and hurriedly said, "Big brother." Bosco waved his hand as if he hadn't heard anything. Looking at Borg, he asked softly, "You look like you're wondering why things have come to this point?" Borg didn't seem to be enraged at all. Borg opened his mouth and slightly raised his head, peeping at Bosco's emotionless expression. For a moment, he didn't know whether to answer or to remain silent. Just as he was about to look at his third uncle, Enoch, who was standing next to him, suddenly he roared, "Raise your head and answer me." Yes, yes, father. All right, I'll tell you now." Bosco's ferocious expression quickly receded as he regained his usual calmness and said in a deep voice, "After reaching an agreement a few months ago, our relationship with Bran has gradually eased. The Grey Coat Army isn't the only people in the City of Dawn. Gradually, the surrounding rural civilians, bold merchants, curious travelers from afar, and so on have continuously appeared in the city. Just a few days ago, the Temple of Light also sent people over to build a church here." After a pause, he continued, "After several discussions, Lhasa finally chose to reject. Of course, the rejection was very tactful, and he also gave many reasons. In short, the current environment is not suitable. On the surface, it's just building a church. There's no such thing as an unsuitable environment. But in reality, the power and influence of the Temple of Light is very large, so much so that it's far beyond what we can vaguely see. In a sense, even the Bran Imperial Court has to be wary of them. So for such a power, the Bran Empire can only constantly appease them and give them various rights. The clergymen of the Temple of Light don't have to work, but they get more. Luxurious robes, exquisite food, and countless guards and cavalrymen. Every place, every brick, every tile, and every colored statue in every magnificent church is not paid for by the Temple of Light. Instead, it comes from the tax treasury of the Bran Empire, as well as the pockets of every rich or poor believer. In addition, after every church is built, a large amount of land and farms will be given within 100 miles of the church. The number and scale of the land will vary according to the size of the church. Yes, this is the rule of the Empire's law. Just like the nobles, they hire civilians to farm and receive most of the fruits of their labor without paying anything. They just want to be more dignified, but there are foolish civilians who fall for this trick. At this point, the Lord Adam, who had experienced many ups and downs, shook his head slightly. It seemed that because of the change in his status, he was no longer interested in the way the Temple of Light operated. But the Grey Coat Army is different, not to mention that the land around the City of Dawn has already been distributed. Even if there's any left, it's impossible for them to give it to the Temple of Light for free. The reason is very simple. The people in the Grey Coat Army are no longer ordinary civilians. Perhaps they don't think so far ahead, but looking at the current situation where they have sacrificed countless lives to obtain the fruits of their labor, would they be willing to give it away so easily? Moreover, they're still hired farmers. It's undeniable that there are also believers of the God of Light among them. But now, most of them are just believers. They won't foolishly give everything they have. The reason for this is also very simple. When their families are destroyed and their wives and children are separated, where is the benevolent God of Light that they previously believed in? You don't understand? Okay, let me give you another example. When our family was still a noble, how much did we donate to the church every week? Quite a lot, right? It's funny that when I was smuggling, I donated a lot for peace of mind and for safety. But what happened in the end? What happened still happened, and we ended up like this. Now, our family has been on the brink of death several times with the help of the Grey Coat Army, and we have finally become members of the Parliament with our own efforts, ascending to a position that we didn't even dare to dream of in the past. He sighed. Borg, today is different from the past. We are like this, and so is the Grey Coat Army. Compared to the illusory god, now everyone is more willing to believe in their own hands. And this has also shaken the foundation of the Temple of Light. Haha, if it were a few people, it would be fine, but the Grey Coat Army has a scale of more than 100,000 people. If this trend were to spread, do you think the Temple of Light would want to see this happen? Borg heard this and shook his head in a daze. His face was pale, without a trace of blood. Enoch, who was beside him, wasn't any better. He vaguely knew that the Grey Coat Army and the Temple of Light were not on good terms. But due to limited information, knowledge, and so on, he naturally couldn't see as clearly as Bosco. Haha, the world has seen that the Grey Coat Army has been causing trouble for so many years and has become a thorn in the side and flesh of the Bran Empire. But they didn't see that at the same time, we have also become the heretical cult that the Temple of Light refers to. The former seems irreconcilable, but now they are also cooperating. But the latter is absolutely impossible to reconcile. In the end, if one side doesn't make concessions, which is us, who are weak, the result can only be a fight to the death. Of course, the conflict hasn't reached that point yet. And even if the Temple of Light is quite afraid of the Grey Coat Army, their consistent neutral position, external image, and so on abound their hands and feet. It's not good for them to directly attack us. That's why Rosa dared to reject the proposal of the people from the Temple of Light. But Borg, you have given them the best excuse. For great deacons of light, one inspector of the four directions, one cardinal archdeacon, and 3 paladin commanders. With such hatred, there's no need for other excuses. Sigh. Tang in. How did you do it? Even if he had already received the news, even if Bosco was shrewd, he couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. His face was full of disbelief. But this wasn't the main point. Borg's lips trembled, and he stammered. This. So, the Temple of Light is going to attack us? Idiot. Bosco glanced at him coldly and slowly got up from the wooden chair. It's the Temple of Light and the Bran Empire's army. You have chosen a good time. The barbarians in the northern wilderness have retreated, and the Bran no longer has any worries. The Temple of Light has such a righteous excuse for revenge, even if it's the new aristocratic forces that are closely cooperating with us. I think this time they won't even dare to inform us. He took a step forward. Now you know what kind of big trouble you've caused. I know. He stepped forward again. Now you know the reason? Seeing Bosco closing in step by step, Borg was terrified. His kneeling body couldn't help but lean back to escape. I understand, Father, that's good. Bosco interrupted directly. His face was gloomy like water, and he stepped straight in front of Borg. But at this moment, Enoch, who was on the side, heard the words, I'll let you know when you die. His face changed greatly, and he quickly stood between the two of them. He used both of his hands to block and anxiously pleaded, Big brother, what are you doing? Before he finished his words, scram. Bosco suddenly roared. His voice was like a thunderclap, and it shook the doors and windows of the hall. Enoch was stunned on the spot. He looked at Bosco, who was roaring like a lion and couldn't recover for a long time. Phew, sorry. Bosco seemed to have vented his anger. He sighed and patted Enoch's shoulder. Don't worry. Although I really want to kill him, he is indeed the only heir of the family. This time, I'm just leaving him a memento. With that said, Bosco bypassed him and walked to the front of the trembling Borg. He leaned over and reached out to touch the scar on his left cheek. Fighting with me, show, scheming against Tang, and does this scar make you so unconfident? No. Borg hurriedly shook his head. His upper body was trembling because of fear, but his kneeling legs were extremely tense as he resisted the desire to escape. This awkward appearance made Borg look very strange. In that case, Bosco slowly touched the centipede-like scar that had almost healed, and the outer layer of dead skin was gradually falling off. His eyes flashed coldly, and his 5 vigorous fingers suddenly became bony. I'll help you throw it away. Hiss! Bosco's hand flashed, and the sudden sound of flesh tearing was horrifying. Immediately, a large amount of blood suddenly spurted out. An extremely sharp and hoarse, painful howl instantly resounded in the hall. Borg covered his face and rolled on the ground. Blood splattered everywhere, and he was in a state of madness. Bosco casually threw away the centipede-like scar that he had torn off. He slowly raised his hand and wiped the blood that splashed between his eyebrows. His face was expressionless as he quietly looked at Borg, who was crazily rolling on the ground beside his feet. After a while, the hall returned to silence. Borg had already been carried down for treatment, but his scar had been torn off again. Although his face was covered in blood and looked extremely tragic, such an injury certainly wouldn't kill him. Borg was still conscious when he was carried down. Of course, this injury still dealt a great blow to Borg, not only on the physical level, but also on the mental level. This kind of real act of tearing open the scar for the second time undoubtedly doubled the previous humiliation that Borg felt. He would probably never forget it in his life. In this way, it could be considered as a real memento. Looking at the large pool of blood in the middle of the hall that hadn't been cleaned up in time, Enoch shook his head. "Brother, you were too impulsive this time. I'm afraid it will leave a shadow in Borg's heart. Let him in the future." "In the future? Let's talk about the future after we get through this." Bosco pinched the bridge of his nose and looked a little tired as he waved his hand weakly. Enoch was silent. This was the truth. Because of Borg's sudden move, no matter what they had planned previously, they would have to directly overturn it. He looked up helplessly and sighed. "Brother, how are you going to deal with this? We should be the only ones who know about this news now. Should we spread the news and inform Lhasa and the rest?" Bosco shook his head and frowned. "What's the use of informing them? This time, there are no barbarians in the northern wilderness to hinder us. With the high-end forces of the Temple of Light and the regular army of the Brand, we have no chance of winning. Then, should we evacuate the City of Dawn? That's feasible. But..." Bosco squinted his old eyes, and his drooping face twitched a few times. "I can't accept it. It wasn't easy for us to struggle to get to where we are today, and the glory of our family is about to reach its peak openly. Once the Gray Coat army retreats, everything will be over. No, we can't miss this opportunity." Bang! He slammed the wooden table beside him, and the cooling tea instantly spilled over. At that moment, Bosco's expression suddenly became particularly fierce. "I didn't want to take this path, but now, I can only say sorry." Enoch's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. He instantly understood who he was apologizing to. He was slightly stunned and then licked his dry lips. "Brother, you mean betrayal?" He nodded. Other than that, we have no other choice." Bosco said, "Originally, after getting along with each other for so long and seeing that it was really unnecessary, I planned to use my identity as a counselor to gradually leave the Gray Coat army. But now, the plan can't keep up with the changes, so I can only be a villain again." Enoch was silent, and his breathing was slightly rapid. From the bottom of his heart, he, including Bosco and everyone else in the family, actually disapproved of the Gray Coat army's attitude. He loathed the strange smell that seemed to never go away from these people. He loathed the vulgar slang of these people. He loathed the stupid brains of these people who only knew how to fight and kill. However, after all, they had been through life and death together for such a long time. They had crawled through bloody battles together. Humans were not plants and could not be emotionless. Shaking his head and taking a deep breath, Enoch instantly cleared the inappropriate thoughts in his mind and asked coldly, "What should we do specifically?" "Recently, I have also used my identity as a counselor to contact a few outsiders. I'll write a letter later, and you find a way to quickly send it out and ask them to contact the people from the Temple of Light." Pause for a while. Bosco knocked on his forehead. "Our bargaining chip now is the identity of an insider. Later, you go and investigate the city defense and see which teams will be guarding the city in the next few days. We must put our people in this area. The other side won't think of besieging the city with countless casualties." Well, but those lunatics from the Temple of Light are not stable. We also have to find a way to contact the great aristocrat brand, and it must be on the side of His Highness. This time, our bargaining chip is the identity of a counselor. Just say that we are willing to use this title in exchange for a special pardon. This should not be a problem. They can get a great merit and a counselor's seat with little effort. This deal is not a loss for them. As for our request, let's make it count. After such a big sacrifice, we have to get something back. There's also the problem of the peripheral patrol. This change was too sudden. Even someone as astute as Bosco could only reverse engineer every step of the plan. He thought of one thing after another. It was very long-winded and complicated. Now, from his standpoint, it was naturally best to completely kill the Gray Coat Army here. Otherwise, his family would be assassinated for the rest of their lives. But he had to admit that there was not much time left for him. Compared to killing the Gray Coat Army, his first consideration was how to get his family out of this matter and ensure their safety. After discussing for a while, Bosco and Enoch racked their brains and finally came up with a preliminary plan to ensure the safety of their family. After all, the details of this plan were enough to keep them busy for a few days. After sorting out the various details, Enoch hurriedly put the plan in his arms and was about to leave. But at this moment, Bosco seemed to have thought of something and suddenly slapped his forehead. Wait, there's one more person we must not ignore. Who? Michaud and his subordinate Gray Space team. Enoch was stunned. He subconsciously looked at the pool of blood in the hall and frowned. Will he affect our plan? Bosco nodded. Well, don't underestimate Michaud. You don't know. He is directly under Rose's command. Some time ago, when he came back to recuperate, dozens of people from the Gray Space searched every corner of Dawn City. Previously, the city defense caught a few brand spies, and it was them who did it. So I'm afraid our next series of actions won't be hidden from him. Then what should we do? Get rid of him first? It's a bit risky. As far as I know, he's not weak. Well, take some time in the afternoon and bring all the warriors to meet him. If we can get him to join us, that's naturally the best. If not, we'll get rid of him tonight. Okay, but brother, he's Tang, unsubordinate. He probably won't agree to our request. It's hard to say. Let's give it a try. Bosco squinted his eyes, which flashed with light. This person is somewhat different from Twain. Chapter 644. In the evening, on the second floor of a tavern in the City of Dawn, candlelight flickered in the large space, and tables and chairs were arranged neatly. However, there were not many customers. There were only about 4 or 5 people near the window. They seemed to have booked the entire place. Judging from the yellow tung oil on the tables and chairs and the new decorations on the walls, this tavern should have been opened not long ago. The structure of the 2-story building, as well as the excellent overlooking view from the square windows, showed the tavern owner's ingenuity and considerable wealth. The truth was that the owner of this tavern was a foreigner who came to make a fortune. There were many such daring businessmen in the City of Dawn. However, no one knew that the real owner of this tavern was the Bosco family. In fact, such behavior was not surprising. Most of the people in the Gray Coat Army who had some status would do such a thing. After all, the reform was successful, and the stage victory was achieved. The many years of fighting were basically over. Therefore, they naturally had to make plans for their future lives. As for whether they used their identity or whether the source of the funds was legal, it was not important, was it? In short, it was reasonable to say, this is what I exchange for with my life. Simple values. Of course, what was reasonable might not be legal. It was undeniable that after such a great success, the concept of being conferred titles and sharing the spoils was the general trend. Even Rosa could not resist it for the time being. This represented the conflict of values between two groups. If they were forcefully stopped, it was likely to arouse resentment and lead to uncontrollable consequences. Therefore, the only thing Rosa could do was to persuade them tactfully. Of course, there would definitely be people who would not listen, but it was okay. However, if anyone went overboard and caused dissatisfaction among the civilians, then sorry, they would be taken down without any discussion. Bosco's eyes were undoubtedly sharp. Naturally, he saw the loophole in Rosa's strategy. Therefore, although he was the first to participate, he did it flawlessly and kept a low profile. In the end, not only did he avoid risks and reap practical benefits, but he also gained a clean reputation. He was experienced in his methods. However, now, as he touched the exquisite pear-wood doors and windows and looked at the elegant decoration in the hall, Enoch shook his head slightly and sighed in his heart. His brother had made a loss in this business. Looking into the distance, the City of Dawn was not as noisy as the other cities in the brand. The buildings of various heights were arranged in a picturesque manner, and sparks were embedded in them. There was a wide road in between, and some figures could be seen leisurely walking around after the meal. Faint laughter could be heard, and the atmosphere was peaceful and peaceful. It was a pity in his eyes. It was as if he could see the golden spears and armored horses suddenly charging in, and the scene of this bustling city being turned into ruins in an instant. Enoch couldn't help but close his eyes. His chest rose and fell slightly as he took a deep breath to suppress the shame in his heart. At this moment, a voice came from below. "Stop! We need to search him. Scram!" With a cold sneer, Enoch suddenly opened his eyes and looked in front of the tavern downstairs. There were two groups of people standing opposite each other. On one side, there were more than 10 guards on his side. On the other side, there were only 3 people. They stood quietly in a triangular formation, like sharp arrowheads. Just as Enoch looked down, the first person sensitively raised his head. The twilight was kind, but the cold gaze was like a flash of cold lightning that went straight to the bottom of Enoch's heart. The corner of Enoch's mouth could not help but twitch. He forced himself to look back and frowned. He looked at the cold gaze below. Is this Michaud? Damn it! Why does he look more terrifying than Tangen? Pausing, he waved his hand and motioned the guards below to make way for them. Withdrawing his gaze, the 3 people below calmly walked through the encirclement of the guards and stepped straight into the tavern. Phew! Enoch exhaled softly, and some of the haze in his heart dissipated. He thought to himself, no wonder the situation is so urgent. This Michaud is really not an ordinary person. In fact, it was normal for Enoch to think that Michaud was more terrifying than Tangen. In the final analysis, this was the so-called evil spirit. As everyone knew, a person's temperament was not fixed. On the contrary, it was constantly changing because of subjective and objective factors. The so-called evil spirit was mostly formed by killing people. The more people one killed, the more one's mentality, personality, gaze, and even appearance would change. It would seem as if there were countless vengeful spirits surrounding one's body. Their faces would become blurry and dim, causing one's heart to shudder. Michaud had killed a lot of people, and it was not an exaggeration to say that his hands were covered in blood. In addition, he did not hide it all, so it was natural for him to have an evil spirit. Of course, Twain had killed more people, and the 1,000 Slayers medal was not for nothing. However, he had already surpassed Michaud's level, and he had consciously restrained himself, so he looked harmless. Naturally, no one would find him terrifying. It could be said that Tang In and Michaud were both teachers and friends. But now, they were on completely different paths, and they were gradually drifting further and further apart. The wooden stairs shook slightly, and immediately, Michaud appeared in the hall on the 2nd floor. Haha, Michaud. I've heard of your name, but it's a pity that I didn't have the chance to meet you today. Please, someone, bring me a bottle of good wine. Enoch stood at the wooden table and waved his hand. He was enthusiastic, but not overly exaggerated. Michaud looked at Enoch calmly, but he did not say anything. He walked silently to the table and sat down, his eyes drooping as if he was staring at the oil lamp on the table. Enoch shrugged and sat down on the opposite side of the wooden table. He rubbed his hands and said, "Oh, I haven't introduced myself yet." "Excuse me." Michaud was not moved by Enoch's words. He frowned and interrupted. "Where is my man?" This was the reason why Michaud came. Because of Tang In, no one in the gray space had a good impression of the Bosco family, and they had never relaxed their surveillance of them. However, not long ago, when Michaud returned to Dawn City to recuperate, a newly recruited member of the Gray Space fell into Enoch's hands during routine surveillance. From this matter, the newly recruited member's strength undoubtedly needed to be improved. However, from another point of view, it also showed that the Bosco family had always been afraid of Tang Un's Gray Space. Enoch was stunned for a moment, but he quickly reacted and clapped his hands. The wooden stairs trembled again, and several guards carried up a figure covered in blood. "Oh, sorry. We had a little trouble when we invited this brother." Enoch spread out his hands, and there was no sarcasm in his expression. Instead, there was a touch of admiration. "As far as I know, this brother joined not long ago, right? Well, more than 10 people chased after him, and more than half of them were killed or injured. In the end, we had to use the family's men of sacrifice to successfully invite him. TSK, as expected of the Gray Space I've seen." Michaud looked up and narrowed his eyes, as if he didn't hear Enoch's words. He looked at the unconscious member behind Enoch, and after confirming that his life was not in danger, he looked back at Enoch and pursed his thin lips. "What's your condition?" "Haha, straightforward." Enoch now understood Michaud's character. It was undoubtedly a fool's dream to negotiate with such a strong-willed and taciturn person. He touched his chin and said, "What do you think of the Gray Coat Army?" Michaud was silent, and he looked at Enoch with an indifferent expression, frowning slightly. Even Enoch, who had seen a lot of things, felt uncomfortable in his heart when he was stared at like a poisonous snake staring at a corpse. Speechless, he shook his head and said, "All right then. I heard that the reason you joined the Gray Cloth Army was because you wanted to take revenge for your parents who were killed by the thieves." Pause for a while. Enoch looked at Michaud's expressionless face and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Is he still a freaking human? How can he be indifferent to such news? Even if he's angry about our private investigation, you haven't gotten any information about the whereabouts of the bandits, right? Yes, there are countless bandits in the north. Finding them is undoubtedly like looking for a needle in a haystack. It's too difficult. We can't do it for the time being. However, if we expand our field of vision and mobilize more forces, such as the police station system in Bronco City, or issue missions in the various official unions, the possibility of finding them will undoubtedly be greatly increased. Michaud nodded slightly, and his gloomy face looked thoughtful. "Oh, so you want to betray us?" Enoch, who was in the midst of organizing his words, suddenly had his thoughts exposed. He couldn't help but be stunned, and his expression became strange. At 2:00 in the afternoon, through the secret business channels of your family, several secret messages were secretly sent out. At 4:00 in the afternoon, the garrison of the Western Checkpoint was changed in advance. The 3 Army Swordsman Regiment was stationed there. If I remember correctly, the regiment commander called you Third Uncle. In the flickering candlelight, Michaud's expression was cold as he talked about the seemingly scattered and unrelated news. But gradually, Enoch's eyes slowly narrowed, and his 2 palms under the table were tightly clenched together. Michaud's words were not long, and they were soon finished. However, the hall suddenly became silent. The surrounding air was as thick as water, and it became more and more dignified and cold. Not far away, the guard who had just brought the exquisite wine bottle was halfway to the table. He expressionlessly placed the bottle on the table and reached for the hilt of his sword at his waist. Clap, clap, clap. Enoch clapped his hands, and his expression gradually became fierce. Good, good, good. I admire you. It seems that I can't deny it even if I want to. He spread out his hands and placed them on the table, leaning his upper body forward. So, what do you mean? Michaud's expression was calm, as if he didn't feel the mountainous, killing intent around him. Instead, he slightly tilted his head and looked behind Enoch at the quiet night scene of Dawn City outside the window. The corners of Enoch's eyes twitched when he saw this, but he forced himself to suppress the surging anger in his heart and waited quietly. At the same time, there were many people lurking around the tavern, waiting for a signal or an order. After a while, When the heavy pressure in the hall was almost suffocating, Michaud lowered his eyes, and half of his face was hidden in the shadows. The corners of his mouth suddenly curled up, and he murmured in a low voice, "Many people will die." I agree. Chapter 645. Author's Note, 2,900 words. Civet Cat's moral integrity is unquestionable. Fate was fickle, and the world was unpredictable. Layers upon layers of yellowed history books had proven that it was best not to belittle any insignificant thing, because even if it was just an insignificant component, it still had its mission and function. The only difference was that when the component was added, it could make the entire machine operate in an orderly manner. If the component was placed in an unsuitable position, it could paralyze the entire machine. Who would have thought? It was just a resentful thought of Borg. He had only wanted to kill someone, but the situation had escalated to such an unsalvageable stage. It was the same night. Under the cover of the tranquil and peaceful atmosphere, the undercurrents in the city of dawn were quietly surging. They were brewing monstrous waves that could destroy everything. In the distance, Josiah and the rest were rushing madly towards the city. Further away, the blockade around the 100,000 mountains had been formed. Large groups of light knights and Brand's regular soldiers were gathering. Looking further north, all the way to the front line, the Grey Flame Legion's barracks outside the city. In the boundless twilight, bonfires burned brightly. It was time for the soldiers to return to the barracks and rest. However, there seemed to be some chaos here. Shadows gathered, and there were noises everywhere. "You're causing trouble for no reason. How dare you be so arrogant here? Either hand over the culprit or let us search your barracks. If not, you'll bear the consequences. Slap your mother's face. Which king eye of yours saw us hitting someone? Tisk stubborn. The blood on my brother's face is the evidence. A bunch of country bumpkins. I'm warning you, you won't be able to escape. Chicken blood, dog blood, and pig blood. Who knows what kind of blood that is? You're just a bunch of pussies. If you want to fight, just say it. I'll accompany you. You're making such a childish excuse. How dare you say it? *CK, let's fight. Come on, let's fight one-on-one. Come on, I'll beat you to death." The crowd surged, and it was a mess. Separated by a row of crumbling fences, the soldiers on both sides could almost poke each other's faces with their fingers. Their eyes were as wide as bells, their faces were red, and their saliva was splashing everywhere. All kinds of vulgarities were spat out, and in the end, it formed a roar that sounded like a group of flying mountains. Some of them were inarticulate and impatient, and some of them were people who believed in the fist. They were trying to flip through the fence to have a good chat with the other party, but they were immediately beaten down by the other party's random punches. Seeing that their brothers were at a disadvantage, they naturally didn't give up and went up to help. In an instant, countless fists flew above the fence. Most of them missed, but there were also some that happened to meet the other party's fists. Immediately, a dense wave of impact and the sound of bones breaking rang out. Wild roars of pain and blood splattered everywhere, adding to the violent atmosphere. It could be seen that both sides were restraining themselves. Otherwise, how could the squeaky and shaking barricade possibly stop the thousands of hot-blooded, brawny men? However, the situation was getting closer and closer to getting out of control. If there was even the slightest accident, there would immediately be a tragic situation where blood would splatter everywhere. Right now, there wasn't a single officer who was powerful enough to step forward to calm the situation. Or rather, there was one, but now they were all involved, the situation became even more chaotic. At this moment, inside the barracks, behind the bare-chested man, a few people were gathered together. Although they didn't participate, looking at the chaotic scene in front of them, they raised their heads and roared from time to time, as if they didn't mind watching the show. Damn, the fight hasn't started yet. Why aren't Luke and the others back yet? Don't tell me they went overboard and got caught. Forget it. He just snuck into the command center. In the gray space, apart from the boss of me show, this kid is the best at hiding and escaping. Let's wait and see. Hey, if you ask me, We should just fight our way out. First, they won't let us leave, and now they're using the excuse of searching the barracks again and again. They're clearly trying to burn the bridge after crossing the river. You make it sound so easy. In any case, it's best to get evidence first. Otherwise, it won't be easy to clean up the mess later. Where's Fry? He's an officer, so naturally he's at the front. Here, he's the one who's being pointed at and scolded. TSK, you really can endure it. If it were me, I would have punched him long ago and let him know. Oh, what was the bosses saying? Why are the flowers so red? That's it. Needless to say, the ones who were watching the show were naturally David and the others. The reason why they were here was because they were also one of the soldiers who had come to support the front line this time. Therefore, after the barbarians in the northern wilderness retreated, because of the Brand military's intentional or unintentional delay, they and most of the gray coat army soldiers in the Tsangyin defense zone could only stay here helplessly and wait for the distant moment of return. In such a huge barracks, it was naturally impossible for the gray coat army to be the only troop. This situation was also not allowed by the Brand military, so there were still Tsangyin soldiers who had the advantage in numbers around the gray coat army's encampment. Normally, although Tsangyan's regular soldiers and this side never saw eye to eye, under the restrictions of each other's officers, they could still maintain a peaceful state. Occasionally, there would be conflicts, but they were basically kept to a small extent. However, this situation had changed recently. About 2 days ago, Tsangyan's military suddenly issued a military order, intending to collect all the armors and weapons of the soldiers here. Needless to say, this absurd order was not accepted by the gray coat army soldiers. Not only did they not trust the other party, but on the battlefield, there were situations where both sides would not help each other, so naturally, they were very cautious. Moreover, most of the armors and weapons were brought by the gray coat army soldiers themselves, so naturally, there was no reason for them to hand them over. Since then, David and the others could always see the Tsangyin soldiers loitering around and finding all kinds of excuses, intentionally or unintentionally provoking them. They were all experienced on the battlefield, so naturally, the gray coat army soldiers were not afraid and immediately retaliated. After a few rounds, the smell of gunpowder between the two sides became stronger and stronger. Finally, when dusk fell tonight, about a few thousand Brand soldiers suddenly rushed over, using the excuse that one of their brothers was beaten up, to open the barracks and let them in to search. Not to mention whether this was true or not. The soldiers of the Gray Cloth Army, who were already angered, would naturally not agree to this request. Thus, this chaotic scene appeared before their eyes. The more David and the others thought about it, the more they felt that this matter was fishy. However, because they were in the barracks, their information was basically cut off from the outside world, so they could not make a clear judgment. Thus, taking advantage of this chaos, Luke slipped out of the barracks with some people and went to the headquarters of the Tsangyin army stationed here to see if he could find anything. David, is Luke back? Fry asked as he tidied up his armor. He walked over in a sorry state. David looked at the angry crowd around him and shook his head helplessly. I don't know. I don't think so. Is everything all right, damn? Fry wiped the saliva off his armor in disgust and couldn't help but say angrily, why are these Brand soldiers suddenly so unreasonable? Have they all gone crazy? I think they just want to cause trouble. They might even be waiting for the order to attack now. Austin, a member of the first batch of Gray Space members, pursed his lips and said worriedly, Brother Fry, we have to make a move first. Otherwise, it will be difficult for everyone to escape. That's what I'm worried about. Fry frowned and shook his head. He sighed and said, I hope that's not the case. Otherwise, not just here, but all the soldiers of the Gray Coat Army at the front line will be attacked. Also, he paused and turned to look south. I'm afraid something will happen in Dawn City. Sigh, it wasn't easy to get a peaceful environment. David and the others couldn't help but fall silent when they heard that. That was the truth. If the Brand really intended to attack the Gray Coat Army, Dawn City, as their headquarters, naturally wouldn't be able to escape a calamity. At that moment, Austin's face lit up. Luke is back. Everybody immediately turned their heads and saw Luke dashing out of the crowd toward them. As soon as he got close, Luke didn't even have time to catch his breath. He handed over an open letter and said with an ugly expression, "I stole this from Grey Flame's command center, Brother Fry." Phew, the situation isn't good. Fry, David, and the others hurriedly opened the letter and glanced at it. Their faces instantly darkened. This was an order from the Brand's military. The general meaning was to kill all the gray coat army soldiers here on the spot and leave no one alive. F***CK. David cursed and clenched his fists. Without another word, he turned around and strode toward the chaos. They're still here. Let's get ready to fight our way out. Taking a deep breath, Fry stuffed the letter into his pocket. His face was cold and solemn, and his killing intent instantly overflowed. There is no doubt that with this military order, everything that had happened previously could be explained. As for why the other party hadn't attacked yet, it was probably because the surrounding encirclement hadn't been completed yet. On the other side, David pushed with both hands and quickly squeezed to the front of the chaotic crowd. Looking left and right, he walked toward a gray flame soldier who seemed to be a low-ranking officer who was yelling. He kicked out. Boom! A section of the barricade that had been destroyed repeatedly flew into the air and finally collapsed into pieces of wood that fell in all directions. The surrounding crowd fell silent. They stared blankly as David took 2 steps forward and grabbed the low-ranking officer's shoulder. He pulled him up and asked coldly, "Do you know why the flowers are so red?" Before the low-ranking officer could react, his vision was covered by a fist that grew bigger and bigger. Bang! Because you're asking for it. He was sent flying. Blood splattered in the air like flowers. Pulling out his sword, David charged into the gray flame soldiers like a ferocious tiger and roared, "Brothers, follow me and kill. Kill! Kill!" Chapter 646. Boom! Thunder rumbled and rain drizzled. The same weather had been suppressed in the northern wilderness for half a day. In the afternoon, it finally erupted in the 100,000 mountains of Bran. It was only drizzling now. However, everyone knew that a thunderstorm was bound to follow after such a huge storm in this gloomy weather. In the city of Dawn, the clothes that were supposed to be collected had already been collected. Those who were supposed to go home had also gone home. The commoners continued to live their lives peacefully as usual. Occasionally, a few naughty children would rush into the rain to play. However, they would be cursed and beaten back by their respective adults. It was a noisy and heartwarming scene. At this moment, in an inconspicuous bungalow in the West District, the wooden door opened. A young man with a face full of vicissitudes was holding 2 strangely shaped wooden sticks. He stepped over the threshold with difficulty and walked out. On the opposite side of the road, an expert who was doing some handiwork by the door looked up and shouted in surprise, "Andy, are you going out in this weather?" "Yes, I have some matters to attend to." The young man looked anxious and replied absent-mindedly, "Oh, why don't I ask Big Brother to send you?" "No need. It's very close." "Thank you, Auntie." The young man hurriedly rejected the kind woman's help. He twisted his arms and used the wooden sticks to replace his legs. He was not slow at all. He quickly rushed into the rain. This young man was called Angus. He had lived here for a long time. Although he lived in seclusion, he was quite familiar with his neighbors. Some gossipy women gathered information during their leisure time. They roughly knew that Angus used to be a soldier. His crippled legs were probably broken on the battlefield. There were many injured soldiers in the city of Dawn. No one would discriminate against them, because everyone knew why these people had become like this. They were fully deserving of the title of heroes. Therefore, whenever someone cooked a good meal, they would bring it over. If they were of suitable age, someone would arrange their marriage. As for this young man named Angus, he always had a smile on his face. Naturally, he was quite popular among the children in the surrounding area. The main reason was that they liked to listen to his war stories. However, sometimes the children would jeer at him, such as when he joked that he was a member of the Gray Space. One had to know that the Gray Space team, which had always made shocking moves and turned the tide several times, had a rather high position in the hearts of the children. There was no malice in this heckling. In the eyes of the children, the omnipotent members of the gray space and the one-legged uncle in front of them could not be connected. Every time, he would just rub the head of the child who made the most noise and dismiss it with a smile. No one knew that Angus was indeed a member of the gray space, and he was even from the first batch. His crippled legs were the result of being framed by Bo Lai. Together with Tang On, they had to escape from the encirclement. In the end, they were crushed by a huge rock during the earthquake in the mine, resulting in comminuted fractures. Of course, no one knew that he had not completely exited the gray space after his legs had no hope of recovery. Instead, under the guidance of Tang In, he took over the responsibility of collecting information about the station. There were two mini intelligence agencies in the gray space. Their duties were basically the same, but they did not interfere with each other. This approach seemed cumbersome, but in fact, it ensured the objectivity and accuracy of the information to the greatest extent. In the beginning, this intelligence work was handled by Tang In and Michaud. However, gradually getting on the right track, and Tang In sometimes had to leave the station, his intelligence work naturally needed someone to take over. In terms of qualifications, David was undoubtedly the most suitable, but his careless character was destined to be unable to do this boring work. So, after some consideration, Tang In finally handed over the intelligence work to Angus. In fact, Angus' talent in this field was average. At least compared to Michaud, there was still a certain gap. However, Angus had a tenacious heart. Although the conditions were not pleasant to hear, it was true. After Angus' legs were broken, his patience had been worn out. Once he found a goal, he would continue to work on it. He was the type of person who could make up for his incompetence with hard work. Tang In did this very secretly, and even Michaud did not know about it. It was not that he did not believe it, but intelligence was supposed to be secret and independent, so the less contact between the two groups, the better. For this reason, Tang In specially asked for some army scouts from Losha and handed them to Angus to train and command. They were specially used to spy on intelligence. Angus did not disappoint Tang In. He still remembered that after Tang In's earth-shattering battle with Sang Pu, he received a negotiation letter from Losha, and at the same time, he also received two detailed intelligence reports about the station. One was from Michaud, and the other was from Angus. See Chapter 319. Recently, Angus discovered that there was an abnormality in Dawn City, but the drizzle was like weaving, constantly patting Angus's anxious face. It was cold and numb, just like his state of mind at this time. The outer checkpoints, the abnormal changes of the guards at the city gate, secret information, and sensitive people secretly left Dawn City through various channels. In just a few days, the Bosco family had been very active, and it was obvious that something big was going to happen. Angus did not know what Bosco wanted to do, but he could at least be sure that if he could get the information, so could Michaud. Not to mention that this matter was related to the Bosco family, which the gray space had always disliked. Similarly, if Angus could see the problem, there was no reason that Michaud could not see it. But why was there no corresponding movement in Dawn City? Was it Chief Losha who was secretly planning something? Or did Michaud not report this information at all? From the bottom of his heart, Angus did not want to suspect Michaud, because he was a brother who had gone through fire and water with him. However, the truth in front of him made him doubt Michaud's words. Perhaps it was because they had not been together for a long time, but Angus's position in the gray space was higher. He was like an outsider, and naturally, he could see something different. For example, Michaud, who was becoming more and more unfamiliar. Because of the convenient information he had, Angus actually discovered the change in Michaud earlier than David and the rest. It was during the extermination of the mountain bandits that Boss Twain had left for a period of time, and it was during this period that Michaud showed an increasingly ruthless and even crazy side. All kinds of interrogation and torture methods were shocking to the eye. Just because he suspected that Michaud had leaked the location of Dawn City, Michaud not only led a group of mountain bandits to wipe out the mountain bandits, but also captured the women who were kept as captives for rape. He also searched for the mountain bandits' relatives and descendants who were hiding in a small town and killed them one by one. In order to train the newly recruited members, he even dissected a human body on the spot and ordered the others to follow suit. There were many similar things. Of course, no matter how many bandits died, Angus did not care. What he cared about was Michaud's increasingly unscrupulous style of doing things to achieve his goals. This was very dangerous. Therefore, when Angus passed the information to Tang Yin, he thought for a long time and finally added some bad signs about Michaud. But Chief Tang did not seem to care. He shook his head, and the raindrops on his hair scattered in an arc, as if to disperse the chaotic thoughts in his mind. Angus sighed slightly. No matter what, he had to tell Chief Losha about the recent abnormalities in Dawn City. As for Michaud, he hoped that he was not involved with this thought in mind. Angus turned his head and looked around the misty surroundings. He tapped the wooden stick lightly and turned to a shortcut path that led to Losha's hut. The various facilities in Dawn City were gradually improving, but some of the more delicate places, such as the main road paved with bricks, were still mostly the original mud. Now that the rain was getting heavier, the muddy path naturally became bumpy and difficult to walk on. When he reached the middle of the path and avoided a shallow depression, Angus's body suddenly trembled, and he suddenly looked up. Dozens of steps in front of him, a few blurry figures stood quietly in the rain. When he turned his head, the intersection that he had just turned to was also blocked by a few figures. Gray space. Angus gritted his teeth and murmured. These people gave Angus a feeling that they were too familiar. He only needed to look at them to recognize them clearly. At this moment, creak. On his left side, the wooden door of a civilian house that was tightly shut slowly opened. Crack. A snake-shaped lightning flashed through the rain, and a familiar feminine face quietly looked at him through the curtain of rain. Chapter 647. Due to the heavy rain and dark clouds, the sky was gloomier than ever. Although it wasn't evening yet, it was actually not much different from twilight. A few minutes ago, in Rosa's house. Here, because of Bosco's suggestion, all the senior ministers of the Gray Coat Army, including Rosa and Old Marshal Omeng, were gathered here. At this moment, Bosco was walking back and forth in the house, explaining something. The surrounding ministers were discussing and exchanging opinions from time to time. There were bursts of laughter, no matter how one looked at it. This was a very normal impromptu meeting. No one suspected anything else. Until a certain moment, boom, the roars from far and near, mixed with warning shouts, instantly broke through the curtain of rain and suppressed the sounds in the house, faintly echoing in everyone's ears. The house suddenly became quiet. Then, what's going on? Is it a hypothetical war? It sounds like a battle in the city. What? There was an uproar, and the harmonious atmosphere was instantly swept away. All the ministers could not believe their ears after they came back to their senses. They looked around blankly, bewildered. Omeng suddenly stood up and turned his head to the west. His face was ashen and solemn. He, who had been immersed in the military for many years, naturally knew what these shouts meant. There were enemies, and they had already broken into the city. Bang! There was a loud bang on the table. Silence. A stern shout was heard, and the house suddenly fell into silence. Rosa frowned and pondered for a few seconds. Then, he raised his head and looked around with probing eyes until he met Bosco's indifferent gaze. The timing was too coincidental. Just when all the senior officials of the Gray Coat Army were gathered and the City of Dawn was without a leader, the enemy had suddenly broken into the city. Therefore, the first suspect was naturally Bosco, who had proposed a meeting. It's finally here. Bosco sighed as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He threw aside the documents sent by the Parliament and spread his hands to the stunned minister. You will never understand the pain of translating simple words to a group of idiots. Bosco. Minister Bosco, what do you mean? Oh, pinching the bridge of his nose helplessly, Bosco shook his head speechlessly. Look, it's just a roundabout way. You don't even know that you're being insulted in front of your face. Really, you mother of asterisk her. When most of the ministers were still in a daze, Omeng immediately realized that the situation outside must have something to do with Bosco. Therefore, he was infuriated as he cursed and was about to beat Bosco up. But right at this moment, whoosh, waves of battle cries suddenly rang out clearly in everyone's ears. Another change had occurred outside the house. Furthermore, the sounds of weapons clashing, the sounds of blades stabbing into flesh, and the screams of those on the brink of death. Everything was so real. Damn it! Hearing the commotion, the faces of the division heads who had just come back to their senses changed drastically, thinking that the enemy had already arrived. But of course, that was impossible. After being stunned for a moment, Rosa and Omen immediately looked at Bosco. Clearly, even if those unknown enemies had already charged into the city, they would not be able to kill their way here in such a short time. Therefore, the commotion outside the house could only be a battle between the surrounding guards and the private forces of the Bosco family that had been arranged in advance. At this moment, the ground in the house suddenly trembled. Zwafan, who had been staying in the corner without any sense of presence, had arrived beside Rosa. Although the simple sword in his hand had not been drawn, the awe-inspiring sword intent that could cause thousands of soldiers to flee suddenly descended. Seeing this, the eyes of the division heads suddenly lit up as they were overjoyed. How could they forget that there was still this great god here? As long as Zwafan was here, even if they could not repel the invading enemies, the safety of everyone present should be guaranteed. But before everyone could feel relieved, Zwafan drew his sword, and a dazzling golden sword light suddenly slashed towards the roof. Boom! Under this tyrannical attack, the roof of Rosa's house instantly collapsed and disappeared, leaving only the surrounding four bare walls. At the same time, whoosh, a violent storm suddenly swept in, and the flame of the oil lamp on the table was instantly extinguished. The house suddenly became dark. But at this moment, no one had the time to pay attention to this situation. They all raised their heads and stared blankly at the sky while facing the rain. There, a greenish-purple spear light shone like a curtain of clouds. It was like thunder from the ninth heaven, flashing with terrifying sparks as it rapidly slashed towards them. Immediately, in mid-air, the dazzling sword light accurately collided with the greenish-purple spear light. Boom! It was like a sudden clap of thunder in the clouds. The sound spread far and wide, suppressing all other noises in the world in an instant. The sky above Dawn City also lit up, and a wave of air filled the air. The violent storm in the surrounding area also stopped, helplessly pouring down on both sides. After a pause, empty realm warriors. And there are two of them. When the battle light disappeared and the rain fell again, everyone in the house looked at the two blurry figures in the sky that seemed to be standing in the clouds and involuntarily cried out in alarm. At this moment, everyone could not help but feel a sense of despair in their hearts. If the other party could stand in the void, then they must have touched the threshold of the empty realm. If there was only one of them, Zwafan might not be unable to resist. But two of them, wouldn't that be enough to crush them? Moreover, it was not just the empty realm warriors that were the problem. More importantly, they had been caught off guard and did not have time to mobilize soldiers or heavy weapons to resist. Thus, no matter how one looked at it, the battle that had just begun was already over. Looking at the two blurry figures in the sky, Zwafan's expression did not change, but his gaze was somewhat complicated. However, this was quickly covered up. He withdrew his gaze and lightly nodded to Rosa. "Wait for me to return." After speaking, a dazzling golden light suddenly surged around his body. He rose into the air and quickly flew out of Dawn City. The two people standing in the sky could definitely see this obvious target. Without hesitation, their figures flashed and also chased after him. In the blink of an eye, the three of them disappeared into the rain. After coming back to her senses, Rosa looked at the rain and opened her mouth, but in the end, she did not say anything. She took a deep breath and raised her hand to tuck her hair behind her ear. She stared at Bosco and asked in a deep voice why. Rosa was slightly startled. Haha, because I have no choice. Bosco's complexion didn't look too good because that azure spear light was clearly aimed at killing them all. If it wasn't for Zwoof Fan's help, he would have died here like everyone else and turned into meat paste or dust. However, after all, Bosco had seen most of the ups and downs of life. He quickly recovered from the joy of achieving his goal and then explained the reason in a good mood. In the end, he sighed and said to Rosa, I told you earlier that Tang Un is a double-edged sword. Although he can bring many changes to the Grey Coat Army, sometimes he can also turn the tide in times of crisis. But his ability to cause trouble and stir up trouble is also not small. He killed so many important people with one shot and completely offended the Temple of Light. What do you want me to do? I have no choice. The Light Palace. Muttering this name that made them shudder with fear, the senior ministers looked at each other in the heavy rain and were silent for a moment. Previously, when the Temple of Light sent people to build a church in Dawn City, Rosa had explained to them the possible conflict between the two sides. Although most of them were inexperienced and had limited vision, they vaguely knew that the Grey Coat Army and the Temple of Light should not be on good terms. So in the end, they agreed with Rosa's rejection of the other party's proposal to build a church. Of course, this rejection could only be said to be taking the initiative to give in. It meant that they could not afford to offend the other party, but they had never thought of offending the other party. But now, as a member of the Grey Coat Army, not only did Tang Un take the initiative to offend the other party, but he also killed so many of the other party's powerful people at once. How could this not make them speechless? However, after a moment of silence, Rosa remained unmoved. She shook her head and said coldly, This is not Tang Un's fault. At least not entirely. In fact, Tang Un has succeeded. The only one at fault is the despicable Borg who stabbed his own people in the back. Bosco spread out his hands generously and said, Let's just say that. You can say whatever you want now. But I want to remind you that Chief Rosa, the people of the Temple of Light, and the Brand's regular army have already killed their way into the city. The Grey Coat Army is doomed this time, and they will be despised in the name of heresy for a long time. As for you, turning around, Bosco raised his finger and pointed at the people who were drenched in the rain and said calmly, You will be hanged one by one or executed by the guillotine. Not knowing if it was because of the cold rain or because of the threatening words, several old ministers couldn't help but shiver when they were pointed at. Bosco saw this and sneered, turned around, and walked towards the door. Haha, don't be afraid. Seeing that we have worked together for so long, I can give you a clear path. That is, it is best to commit suicide before being arrested. Although you will still die, at least you can avoid the pain of being tortured. The enemy came in from the west gate. Bosco paused and turned to look at the calm Rosa. He nodded slightly and said, That's right. Also, you just said that Borg revealed the news a week ago. It takes at least 3 or 4 days to get here from Mountain Creek City. That is to say, you only have 2 or 3 days to operate. Well, in order to avoid being exposed, you can't be transferred from all directions in such a short time. So it's only the west, right? Yes, so what? Do you still expect to escape from the other gates? Ha! Bosco laughed and pointed at himself. Don't be delusional, Leader Rosa. As long as I, who is familiar with the deployment of the troops and the surrounding environment of Dawn City, guide you, you will not have a chance to turn the tables. Yes, but it is a pity that you can't get out. After saying this, Rosa no longer cared about Bosco, who was still frowning. She turned to the European Union and said, Old Marshal, please go out and gather as many soldiers as possible to retreat into the depths of the 100,000 mountains. Remember, don't fight and don't turn back. Retreat until the enemy stops chasing. Listening to the words that seemed to contain the meaning of death, the European Union couldn't help but tremble. Leader, he waved his hand and interrupted. Also, if I die, Josiah will be the new leader of the Grey Coat Army. That's a go. Sigh. Looking at the solemn Rosa, Omeng already knew that she would not change her mind. He couldn't help but let out a long sigh, stomped his feet, and jumped over the bare wall beside him. As a commander of an army, Omeng had been on the battlefield for so many years. Naturally, he had the ability. Although he was old and didn't usually fight, the guards of the Bosco family around him might not be able to stop him. And Omeng's action undoubtedly reminded the ministers present. In an instant, crash, they stood up in a panic, knocking over many tables and chairs. In the face of death, they couldn't care less about their leader who was sitting firmly on the throne. Those who had some ability jumped over the wall, while those who didn't have the ability rushed to the wooden door. It was a mess among them. Only Rosa and Bosco didn't move. After Rosa gave the order, she stared blankly at the row of lifelike wooden carvings on the wide wooden table in front of her. She was in a daze. On the other hand, Bosco was thinking about Rosa's words. Can't get out? Could it be that he had miscalculated something? He instantly came back to his senses and saw that the house had become extremely messy in an instant. He then turned his head and looked at the old figures who were struggling to climb the wall. He couldn't help but feel ridiculous. They still wanted to escape? Ha, how naive. Chapter 648. Was this what it meant to be driven to desperate action? That's ridiculous. Looking at the embarrassed looks of the more than 10 senior ministers under the pouring rain, Bosco's eyes flickered with ridicule as he shook his head in disdain with a psychological advantage. He didn't deny Omeng's strength and admitted that the family guards outside the house shouldn't be able to stop Omeng. However, these old men in front of him who only knew how to rely on their seniority and greed for petty benefits wanted to escape? This was undoubtedly wishful thinking. Besides, even if Omeng rushed out to gather the troops, it would be a waste of effort. Bosco wasn't worried at all because he knew that the brand's troops would only be more than the Gray Coat Army and not less than the Gray Coat Army. Haha, trying to escape into the depths of the 100,000 mountains? Do you really think I'm as stupid as these idiots in front of me? As long as I lead the way and cut off the key points, Dawn City today will be a huge graveyard for the entire Gray Coat Army. Oomph. Bosco looked at Rosa, who was playing with the wooden carving, and snorted coldly. He then stepped out of the door. Although he also wanted to see how Rosa would end up, there were more important things waiting for him to do. Therefore, he could only leave this place to his family guards. Of course, even if he couldn't see it with his own eyes, he couldn't help but have some guesses in his heart. According to Rosa's determined character, she would definitely not choose to be captured. However, she really didn't have any combat power. Well, she would probably choose to commit suicide before the enemy entered the house. This was a decent way to die. At the thought of this, even Bosco, who was used to seeing the world, couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This person who led the Gray Cloth Army from scratch, fought against the Bulan Empire for more than a decade, and stirred up the situation of the continent several times, is finally going to die. Bosco sighed and touched the door handle. Then, an unhurried but unusually firm voice came from behind again. I said, you can't go out now. Ha! Bosco grinned silently and shook his head. He then turned around again and spread out his hands. Leader Rosa, I know your strength very well. Do you still want to keep me here? Or do you just want to waste my time? Oh, you shouldn't be so childish. That's right. I was just wasting your time. Stroking the wooden sculpture, Rosa raised his head and said, but now, old Marshal Omeng should be out of range. Then look at this. Pause for a while. Rosa flipped her right hand, and a wine-red crystal appeared between her fair fingers. It was very eye-catching. Exploding crystal? Bosco was startled when he saw this. His old body suddenly tensed up, but then he slowly relaxed and shook his head. You really know how to play such childish tricks. Well, it may be a little hurtful to say it out loud. However, Leader Losha, the explosive crystal is not omnipotent. If it is in the hands of Zhuofan, or even an elite soldier, I will be in great danger. But in your hands, making an apologetic gesture, Bosco shrugged and smiled. You know that I'm a noble. Although my strength isn't high, I'm only an intermediate fighter, but it's still easy for me to dodge the explosive crystal thrown by an ordinary person like you. Therefore, You should keep this crystal for yourself. After all, you might need it later. Ha! His words were sarcastic, but it was the truth. This was the principle. For example, if a peerless weapon was in the hands of an ignorant child and in the hands of swordsmen, the effects would naturally be very different. However, not necessarily, my great minister. Tossing the explosive crystal casually, Rosa laughed lightly and said, bowing slightly, Bosco replied in a more relaxed and confident manner. Oh, is that so? I'd like to hear more about it. Well, then I'll give you 2 hints. Well, do you still remember that Tang In once captured a group of noble children and forced them to negotiate? The results of that negotiation were very good. We obtained a large amount of food and some military supplies, including a few boxes of explosive crystals. Do you remember? I vaguely remember. Bosco frowned as he recalled and nodded thoughtfully. After all, he had been the leader of a family, so he knew all the details. Although it was a long time ago, he still managed to recall it. There were a few boxes of explosive crystals. I remember that when the City of Dawn was about to be built, someone proposed to transport these explosive crystals out of the warehouse and use them in the city defense. Well, but you seem to have been holding back and didn't agree. Of course I didn't agree, because I had already appropriated them privately. Nodding with a smile, Rosa continued, Old Bosco's memory is really amazing. Then, here's the second hint. His left hand was still tossing the explosive crystals while his right hand put down the wooden carving and pointed to the bare walls around him. The construction of the City of Dawn was centered around this hut. Now that the City of Dawn has been built, there are still no changes to this hut. Previously, you had repeatedly suggested that I tear down this hut and build a magnificent building in line with my status as the leader. I never agreed. Well, guess now, why don't you? There was no need to guess the reason. As long as he combined these 2 hints, everything was clear. Bowing his head stiffly, looking at the ground, Bosco's face instantly turned pale. His legs were trembling, and his body was numb. He opened his mouth, but in the end, he couldn't say a complete sentence. Old Bosco is really smart. With an extremely sincere compliment, Rosa smiled brightly and waved his hand generously. That's right, except for the one in my hand, I buried all the boxes of explosive crystals under the hut. Pause for a while. I'm very afraid of death. I'm afraid that someone will find out and plot against me. So these explosive crystals were buried by me in the dead of night. It took me a lot of effort. There was a little pride in his words, but when combined with the content of his words, it was undeniably terrifying. You're afraid of death. You're King afraid of death? Bosco thought about how he had been stepping on hundreds of explosive crystals for such a long time, and he didn't even know it. In addition, Rosa had been carelessly tossing the deadly explosive crystal in front of him since just now. Even someone as calm as Bosco felt his body go soft and weak, almost losing his image and collapsing to the ground. He muttered absent-mindedly, Madman, you're a madman. Agreed. Rosa nodded directly in agreement. Then, under Bosco's absent-minded gaze, he continued tossing the explosive crystal up and down. Just like what you said just now, I was forced to do it. I had no choice. What should I do? If I didn't go crazy, I definitely wouldn't have survived until now. So, old Bosco, please, don't give me the chance to go crazy again. King. Bosco was completely powerless after hearing this. He trembled and picked up a fallen chair beside him and sat down directly regardless of the mud and rain on it. Phew! He let out a long sigh of relief, and his mind finally cleared up a little. Then, the first thought that came to his mind was doubt. He stared at the ground under his feet and asked dryly, Hundreds of explosive crystals are all below. Of course. Why, old Bosco doesn't believe me. You could try to dig them. I didn't bury them too deep, and there should be a few under your chair. Pausing, Rosa looked at Bosco, who suddenly stiffened and even seemed to have stopped breathing. Rosa covered his mouth and chuckled, but you have to be careful when you dig. TSK, your intermediate warrior strength should be useless. Of course, this was nonsense. If the explosive crystals exploded on such a scale, The range of damage would be unimaginable. Not to mention Bosco, even Zwafan would die here. Just as Bosco was contemplating whether to dig and verify it, the wooden door of the wall was suddenly pushed open with a bang. A middle-aged man rushed in and hurriedly said to Bosco, "Master, Omung is gathering the soldiers in the city to break out of the encirclement. They want you to lead the way now. Get out." Before the middle-aged man finished speaking, Bosco roared. There is no doubt that this was obviously because he was under too much pressure and needed to vent. Then, he waved his hand while panting. "I have a little trouble here. Go find Michaud and let him lead the way." "Well, pass down the order. Don't let our people come near here." Yes." The middle-aged man came in a hurry and left with his tail between his legs. "Michaud?" Sure enough, Rosa raised her eyebrows and suddenly understood why she didn't receive any news that the West City's garrison was changed so easily. After venting his anger, Bosco finally regained his senses and looked at Rosa. "If this continues, you won't be able to survive." "Ha! At this point, do you think I still want to live?" Bosco couldn't help but be silent. Without his help, the people of the Temple of Light and the soldiers of the brand could almost wipe out the Grey Coat army. But this was not enough. If he wanted Omen to gather more soldiers and let more people live, then there must be a target to attract everyone's attention. And there is no doubt that Rosa was absolutely qualified to be this target. "But Bosco, don't worry. As long as you don't act foolishly now, I won't kill you." Bosco was stunned and looked at Rosa in confusion. Surprised? Rosa smirked and narrowed his eyes. "Let's put it this way. When a leader of a team is killed and the team is in disarray, what do you think the new leader should do to unite the people in the shortest time possible?" Bosco nodded, but then his face became a little gloomy. Yes, it is to avenge the previous leader. I don't want to boast, but I know my position in the Grey Coat army. If something happens to me, the Grey Coat army will definitely be in chaos. By then, even if I personally appointed Josiah as the leader, it will still hinder Songkong. And when that time comes, Bosco, you will come in handy. So, you shouldn't die in my hands, but in Josiah's. Chapter 649. Boom, boom, boom. The sky above Dawn City was dark. The wind and rain were heavy, and the thunder was loud. Perhaps the gods were unwilling to see the filth in this city. They wanted to use the dusk to cover up the evil, use the rain to wash away the bloodshed, and use the thunder of the war drums to suppress the screams. Unfortunately, this didn't bring about any substantial changes. The battle was still going on. Killings, escapes, counterattacks, escapes. The cycle repeated endlessly. All right, let's follow the timeline. Let's temporarily shift our attention away from the tragedy in the city. Let's turn our attention to a few kilometers away from the city. Although there were very few people, it was definitely an earth-shattering battle that was slowly unfolding in the open space between the mountains. A dazzling golden figure slowly descended. He landed, turned around, and quietly raised his head to look at the rainy night sky behind him. Immediately after, two blurry figures flew through the air. When they got close, one of them, a middle-aged man with a face full of vicissitudes, landed first. The other person, who was holding a purple spear, was in high spirits. He had sword-like eyebrows and thin lips, and he was still in midair. The rain didn't reach him, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. He looked at the golden figure below with interest. Needless to say, the first person to arrive was Zwafan. He had a simple face, but the dazzling figure just happened to be Zwafan. When he saw the middle-aged man land, Zwafan held his sword and bowed. He calmly said, "Senior brother Haita, long time no see." "Yes, it has been more than 10 years since we last met, junior brother Zwafan." The middle-aged man called senior brother Haita stepped forward and stretched out his hand to support Zwafan. His expression was filled with emotion as he sighed with a trembling voice. Zwafan was silent when he heard this. His expression, which rarely changed, was slightly excited. He then took a deep breath and straightened his body. He looked at the young man who had just exchanged blows with him and asked, "This is—" Haita touched his forehead and said, "Oh, I was careless. Let me introduce you." "No need, senior brother. I will do it myself." The young man with the spear raised his eyebrows and said loudly, "You must be the talented senior brother's Wafan that Master always talks about." "Hee. Greetings, senior brother. I am Wincillin." His words were polite, and there was nothing wrong with his etiquette. However, when coupled with his indifferent expression and his figure that had yet to descend, it faintly revealed a piercing intent. However, Zwafan didn't seem to notice. He revealed a rare smile and lightly nodded his head. All right, it was a simple word. It wasn't a slight, but rather a result of Zwafan's wooden personality. However, Wincillin obviously did not know this. When he heard this, he could not help but frown slightly. Meanwhile, Haita waved his hand and sighed with emotion. Junior brother Zwafan hasn't changed at all after over 10 years. He's still so cautious, steady, and inarticulate. He seemed to be both emotional and also like he was explaining. He briefly mentioned it, and then said, "Zwafan, junior brother Wincillin was the last disciple that Master took in after you left the city. Not only does he come from a famous family, but what's even rarer is his innate talent. It only took him a dozen years to reach the threshold of void level. As his senior brother, I'm far inferior to him." When Zwafan heard this, he once again looked at Winston, who had his chin slightly raised and nodded with a smile. It was true that he was wooden, but he was definitely not stupid. As the saying goes, one must be proud of one's talent. Moreover, Winston had only spent a dozen years to reach the threshold of void level. He did indeed have the right to be proud. Therefore, when Haita's words faintly pointed out Wincillin's arrogant personality, Zwafan could naturally understand and tolerate him. Haita seemed to be in high spirits after reuniting with an old friend. He then exchanged a few pleasantries and asked about the recent situation. However, after a few words, Zwafan directly asked, "Senior brother Haita, what is the purpose of your visit this time?" Dawn City's situation was very critical. More importantly, Losha's situation was even more dangerous. Zwafan naturally did not have time to waste here. Haita couldn't help but pause when he heard this. He looked at Zwafan's calm expression and knew that his intention of stalling for time had been seen through. He shook his head and sighed. "Zwafan, I won't hide it from you. You can't interfere with the Gray Coat Army anymore. Come back to the city with me. Master misses you very much." As expected, Zwafan's eyes drooped slightly. He then raised his head to look at Haita and shook his head firmly. He slowly drew his sword and said, "Sorry, Master, senior brother." It was just a few simple words, but Haita, who was familiar with Zwafan's character, already knew that he couldn't do it. Even so, he was unwilling to give up and said, "Junior brother, this matter is related to the Temple of Light. It can't be settled peacefully. If we didn't know your identity, we wouldn't be the only ones here today. Zwafan, you can't handle it. Listen to senior brother's advice." Zwafan still shook his head lightly. The corners of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something, but the only thing that came out of his mouth was, "I'm sorry." As soon as he finished speaking, a dazzling golden light gushed out from his body. It was as if the sun was slowly rising from the east in the open space of the mountain range. "Ha! You should have done this earlier." With a long laugh, Winston, who was floating in the air, was overjoyed. He swung his spear and green and purple thunder flashed. "Senior brothers Wafan, I'm sorry for offending you. Body and spear as one. It was like a shocking bolt of lightning that could cut through anything. Junior brother, alas." Zwafan was just accumulating power to show his attitude. Based on his character, unless Haita and the other two blocked his path, it was impossible for him to make the first move. But the nature of Winston's attack was different. Not only did it start the battle, it even swept away the warm atmosphere from before. It was impossible to persuade Zwafan. Haita let out a long sigh. When he saw Zwafan's sword chi, he could only open his hands slightly and retreat swiftly. His purpose in coming this time was only to bring Zhuo Fan back to the capital, not to fight. So, unless the situation was critical, it was impossible for him to participate in the siege. Moreover, even though he had a simple and honest character, Haita knew that his junior brother Wensilin was obstinate and self-opinionated. He was always unwilling to accept Zhuo Fan, who had been constantly praised by his master for more than 10 years. Now that he had encountered such a good opportunity, he naturally didn't want Haita to help him. Bang! As soon as Haita retreated from the battle, a roar that sounded like a tsunami hitting the shore instantly reverberated in the valley. Then, ripples that could be seen with the naked eye shook the space. Huge rocks from the mountain peaks in the distance continuously slid down like galloping horses. The rain in the nearby area instantly stopped. Not a single drop of water fell. This attack actually created a small vacuum domain. Whoosh! Wensilin, who had attacked from the air, was shaken back. He quickly rose into the air and laughed. Ha! Good! As expected of senior brother Zhuo Fan, whom Master has praised for more than 10 years. Your battle strength is indeed astonishing. Then, take another attack from me. After he finished speaking, his rapidly rising figure suddenly stopped in the air. The violet-green fighting aura seemed to dye the surrounding clouds. It was a magnificent sight. The next moment, he raised his long spear high and shouted, "Thunder, come!" Amidst his long roar boom, muffled thunder rolled. Sparks of electricity crackled like silk, like a spider's web. They quickly gathered around the long spear like moths to a flame. The sky brightened for a moment. At the same time, sparks of electricity flickered around Wensilin's body from time to time, adding to his imposing aura. He was like a god controlling thunder and lightning. His might was unparalleled. This junior brother, does he really have to go to this extent? Haita muttered in a low voice. He had retreated to the foot of the mountain and couldn't help but sigh helplessly. His expression was somewhat unhappy. Of course, he knew that this magnificent scene in front of him was actually Wensilin's killing move. He wouldn't use it easily, but he didn't think that he would use it so easily against his senior brother Zhuo Fan. It had to be said that today's weather was indeed the best time for him to use this killing move. Borrowing the thunder and lightning elements drifting in the sky, the power of this move was pushed to the peak in one fell swoop. Haita shook his head and looked at Zhuo Fan below. His long robe fluttered without wind. Although he knew that this junior brother Zhuo Fan was also outstanding, he hadn't seen him for more than 10 years. He didn't know what level his strength had reached. Therefore, he secretly made up his mind that if Zhuo Fan couldn't hold on, he would go up and help him. This way, he wouldn't end up in a situation where fellow disciples would kill each other. But immediately, Haita's body shook. He stared fixedly at Zhuo Fan. The sea of golden light around Zhuo Fan's body continued to shrink, compress, and compress, until all of the fighting light entered that brilliant golden sword. He couldn't help but cry out, This, isn't this. At this time, Wensilin in the sky had already pushed his killing move to the level of a large circle. He raised his head and laughed. Ha ha, take this move. He roared, like a comet falling to the ground. He dived down with countless thunder and lightning. Only then would I recognize you as my senior brother. This was the second half of Wensilin's sentence. Just as Haita had thought, Wensilin was not convinced of Zhuo Fan's strength. He was even somewhat hostile. That's right, the two had never met. But in front of his master's mouth, his senior brother's mouth, Wensilin was extremely fed up with this senior brother Zhuo Fan, who was said to be equally talented. He was also a genius, and an extremely rare one who could cultivate two types of fighting light at the same time. How could he be so weak? He had always been inferior to the legendary senior brother. It was under this mentality that Wensilin eagerly requested to come together with senior brother Haita after hearing about this matter. His idea was nothing more than, since you all compare him to me, then I will defeat him in front of you, and you will naturally not say anything. This was his idea, and it had to be said that the success rate was quite high. Wensilin's strength had yet to reach Void Realm. He had only touched the threshold. But after that probing attack, Wensilin found that Zhuo Fan should be the same. At most, Zwafan's cultivation level was higher than his. Half of his body was in Void Realm. But as long as it was not a difference in cultivation level, there was hope. Just as Haita had thought, today's weather was too suitable for Wincillin to fight. It was not an exaggeration to say that this was his home ground. So since the heavens were helping him, he naturally could not miss this opportunity. Thinking so, Wincillin rapidly descended with the power of thunder. He was full of confidence. However, the next moment, a dignified and seemingly ordinary thin golden sword light entered his sight. In an instant, his pupils shrank, and he exclaimed in disbelief, One sword comes from the east. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.